Good afternoon, pretty shiny peoples. So last week we got derailed and I did not have time to make it up due to a lot of circumstances happening. So it's okay because today I'm going to pass where we stopped last week. And the trolls in the comments can fuck off because last week I let them derail me. I did a whole stream and they were too chicken shit to show up. So if they're going to run their mouth here, like the coward that they are more than welcome to, and I will not give them any time of day today. Alright, as always, forgive all the background noise, the barking dogs, the cars driving by, all of that stuff. Alright, today. For those of you who are before I start, for those of you who are tuning in because of my stream last time, this is not one of those streams. I do those occasionally. It's all great fun, whatever. But this is the book club stream. So yeah, unless you're into the book club thing, this might not be your stream. Okay. Back to where we were. We are on book 3, The Wastelands. And he divides it into books, then chapters, then sections, and all of that. So book 1 is called Jake, Fear in a Handful of Dust. It was her third time with live ammunition, and her first time on the draw from the holster Roland had rigged for her. They had plenty of live rounds. Roland had... Wait, hold on. I should have asked if you guys could hear me, but that's okay. I'm going to assume you can. All right. It was her third time with live ammunition, and her first time on the draw from the holster Roland had rigged for her. They had plenty of live rounds. Roland had brought back better than 300 from the world where Eddie and Susanna Dean had lived their lives up until the time of their drawing. But having ammunition in plenty did not mean it could be wasted. Quite the contrary, in fact. The gods frowned upon wastrels. Roland had been raised first by his father and then by Court, his greatest teacher, to believe this, and so he still believed. Those gods might not punish at once, but sooner or later the penance would have to be paid. And the longer the wait, the greater the weight. At first, there had been no need for live ammunition anyway. Roland had been shooting for more years than the beautiful brown-skinned woman in the wheelchair would believe. He had corrected her at first, simply by watching her aim and dry fire at the targets he had set up. She learned fast. Both she and Eddie learned fast. As he suspected, both were born gunslingers. Today, Roland and Susanna had come to a clearing less than a mile from the camp in the woods, which had been home to them for almost 2 months now. The days had passed with their own sweet similarity. The gunslinger's body healed itself, while Eddie and Susanna learned the things the gunslinger had to teach them: how to shoot, how to hunt, to gut and clean what they had killed, how to first stretch, then tan and cure the hides of those kills, how to use as much as it was possible to use so that no part of the animal was wasted, how to find north by Old Star or south by Old Mother, how to listen to the forest in which they now found themselves 60 miles or more northeast of the Western Sea. Today, Eddie had stayed behind, and the gunslinger was not put out of countenance by this. The lessons, which are remembered the longest, Roland knew, were always the ones that are self-taught. But what had always been the most important lesson was still most important: how to shoot and how to hit what you shot at every time. How to kill. The edges of this clearing had been formed by dark, sweet-smelling fir trees that curved around it in a ragged semicircle. To the south, the ground broke off and dropped 300 feet in a series of crumbling shale ledges and fractured cliffs, like a giant set of stairs. A clear stream ran out of the woods and across the center of the clearing, first bubbling through a deep channel in spongy earth and friable stone, then pouring across the splintery rock floor which sloped down to the place where the land dropped away. The water descended the steps in a series of waterfalls and made any number of pretty wavering rainbows. Beyond the edge of the drop off was a magnificent deep valley choked with more firs and a few great old elms which refused to be crowded out. These latter towered green and lush, trees which might have been old when the land from which Roland had come was yet young. He could see no sign that the valley had ever burned, although he supposed it must have drawn lightning at some time or other, nor would lightning have been the only danger. There had been people in the forest in some distant time. Roland had come across their leavings on several occasions over the past weeks. They were primitive artifacts, for the most part, but they included shards of pottery, which could only have been cast in fire. And fire was evil stuff that delighted in escaping the hands which created it. Above the picture book scene arched a blameless blue sky in which a few crows circled some miles off, crying in their old, rusty voices. They seemed restless, as if a storm were on the way, but Roland had sniffed the air and there was no rain in it. A boulder stood to the left of the stream. Roland had set up 6 chips of stone on top of it. Each one was heavily flecked with mica, and they glittered like lenses in the warm afternoon light. Last chance, the gunslinger said. If that holster's uncomfortable, even the slightest bit, tell me now. We didn't come here to waste ammunition. She cocked a sardonic eye at him, and for a moment he could see Detta Walker in there. It was like hazy sunlight winking off a bar of steel. What would you do if it was uncomfortable and I didn't tell you? If I missed all 6 of those itty-bitty things, whopping me upside the head like the old teacher of yours used to do? The gunslinger smiled. He had done more smiling these last 5 weeks than he had done in the 5 years which had come before them. I can't do that, and you know it. We were children, for one thing. Children who hadn't been through our rites of manhood yet. You may slap a child to correct him or her, but in my world, whopping the kiddies is also frowned on by the better class of people, Susanna said dryly. Roland shrugged. It was hard for him to imagine that sort of world. Did not the great book say, "Spare not the birch, so you spoil not the child"? But he didn't believe Susanna was lying. Your world has not moved on, he said. Many things are different there. Did I not see that for myself? Did I not see for myself that it is so? I guess you did. In any case, you and Eddie are not children. It would be wrong for me to treat you as if you were. And if tests were needed, you both passed them. Although he did not say so, he was thinking of how it had ended on the beach, when she had blown 3 of the lumbering lobstrosities to hell before they could peel him and Eddie to the bone. He saw her answering smile and thought she might be remembering the same thing. So what you gonna do if I shoot for shit? I'll look at you. I think that's all I'll need to do. She thought this over, then nodded. Might be. She tested the gun belt again. It was slung across her bosom, almost like a shoulder holster, an arrangement Roland thought of as a docker's clutch, and looked simple enough, but it had taken many weeks of trial and error and a great deal of tailoring to get it just right. The belt and the revolver which cocked its eroded sandalwood grip out of the ancient oiled holster had once been the gunslinger's. The holster had hung on his right hip. He had spent much of the last 5 weeks coming to realize it was never going to hang there again. Thanks to the lobstrosities, he was strictly a left-handed gun now. So how is it? He asked. This time she laughed up at him. Roland, this old gun belt's as comfortable as it's ever going to be. Now do you want me to shoot, or are we just going to sit around listening to the crow music from over yonder? He felt tension worming sharp little fingers under his skin now, and he supposed Court had felt much the same at times like this under his gruff, bluff exterior. He wanted her to be good, needed her to be good, but to show how badly he wanted and needed that could lead to disaster. Tell me your lesson again, Susanna. She sighed in mock exasperation, but as she spoke, her smile faded and her dark, beautiful face became solemn, and from her lips he heard the old catechism again, made new in her mouth. He had never expected to hear these words from a woman. How naturally they sounded, yet how strange and dangerous as well. I do not aim with my hand. She who aims with her hand has forgotten the face of her father. I aim with my eye. I do not shoot with my hand. She who shoots with her hand has forgotten the face of her father. I shoot with my mind. I do not kill with my gun. She broke off and pointed at the mica shiny stones on the boulder. I'm not going to kill anything anyhow. They're just itty bitty rocks. Her expression, a little haughty, a little naughty, suggested that she expected Roland to be exasperated with her, perhaps even angry. Roland, however, had been where she was now, had not forgotten that apprentice gunslingers were fractious and high-spirited, nervy, and apt to bite exactly at the wrong moment. And he had discovered an unexpected capacity in himself. He could teach. More, he liked to teach, and he found himself wondering from time to time if that had been true of Court as well. He guessed that it had been. Now more crows began to call raucously, these from the forest behind them. Some part of Roland's mind registered the fact that the new cries were agitated rather than merely quarrelsome. These birds sounded as if they had been scared up and away from whatever they had been feeding on. He had more important things to think about than whatever it was that had scared a bunch of crows, however, so he simply filed the information away and refocused his concentration on Susanna. To do otherwise with Apprentice was to ask for a second, less playful bite. And who would be to blame for that? Who but the teacher? For was he not training her to bite? Training both of them to bite? Wasn't that what a gunslinger was, when you stripped off the few stern lines of rituals and stilled the few iron grace notes of catechism? Wasn't he or she only a human hawk, trained to bite on command? No, he said, they're not rocks. She raised her eyebrows a little and began to smile again. Now that she saw he wasn't going to explode at her as he sometimes did when she was slow or fractious, or at least not yet. Her eyes again took on the mocking, sun-on-still glint he associated with Detta Walker. They ain't? The teasing in her voice was still good-natured, but he thought it would turn mean if he let it. She was tense, keyed up, her claws already halfway out of their sheaths. No, they ain't, he said, returning her mockery. His own smile began to return, but it was hard and humorless. Susanna, do you remember the Honk Ma Fuzz? Her smile began to fade. The Honk Ma Fuzz in Oxford Town. Her smile was gone. Do you remember what the Honk Ma Fuzz did to you and your friends? That wasn't me, she said. That was another woman. Her eyes had taken on a dull, sullen cast. He hated that look, but he also liked it just fine. It was the right look, the one that said the kindling was burning well, and soon the bigger logs would start to catch. Yes, it was. Like it or not, it was Odetta Susanna Holmes, daughter of Sarah Walker Holmes. Not you as you are, but you as you were. Remember the fire hoses, Susanna? Remember the gold teeth? How you saw them when they used the hoses on you and your friends in Oxford? How you saw them twinkle when they laughed? She had told them these things and many others, over many long nights as the campfires burned low. The gunslinger hadn't understood everything, but he had listened carefully just the same, and remembered. Pain was a tool, after all. Sometimes it was the best tool. What's wrong with you, Roland? Why would you want to go recalling that trash in my mind? Now the sullen eyes glinted at him dangerously. They reminded him of Elaine's eyes when good-natured Elaine was finally roused. Yonder stones are those men, Roland said softly. The men who locked you in a cell and left you to foul yourself, the men with the clubs and the dogs, the men who called you a nizzle cunt. He pointed at them, moving his finger from left to right. There's the one who pinched your breast and laughed. There's the one who said he'd better check and see if you had something stuffed up your ass. There's the one who called you a chimpanzee in a $500 dress. That's the one that kept running his billy club over the spokes of your wheelchair until you thought the sound of it would send you mad. There's the one who called your friend Leon Pinko fag. And the one on the end, Susanna, is Jack Morant. There. Those stones. Those men. She was breathing rapidly now, her bosom rising and falling in swift little jerks beneath the gunslinger's gun belt with its heavy freight of bullets. Her eyes had left him. They were looking at the mica-flecked chips of stone. Behind them and at some distance, a tree splintered and fell. More crows called in the sky. Deep in the game, which was no longer a game, neither of them noticed. "Oh, yeah?" she breathed. "That's so." "It is. Now say your lesson, Susanna Dean, and be true." This time, the words fell from her lips like small chunks of ice. Her right hand trembled lightly on the arm of the wheelchair like an idling engine. "I do not aim with my hand. She who aims with her hand has forgotten the face of her father. I aim with my eye." "Good." "I do not aim with my hand. She who shoots with her hand has forgotten the face of her father. I shoot with my mind." "So it has ever been, Susanna Dean." "I do not kill with my gun. She who kills with her gun has forgotten the face of her father. I kill with my heart." "Then kill them, for your father's sake," Roland shouted. "Kill them all." Her right hand was a blur between the arm of the chair and the butt of Roland's six-gun. It was out in a second. Her left hand descending, fanning the hammer in a flutter almost as swift as the delicate as the wing of a hummingbird. 6 flat cracks peeled off across the valley, and 5 of the 6 chips of stone set atop the boulder blinked out of existence. For a moment neither of them spoke, did not even breathe, it seemed, as the echoes rolled back and forth, dimming. Even the crows were silent, at least for the time being. The gunslinger broke the silence with 4 toneless, yet oddly empathetic words. "It is very well." Susanna looked at the gun in her hand as if she had never seen it before. A tendril of smoke rose from the barrel, perfectly straight in the windless silence. Then slowly, she returned it to the holster below her bosom. "Good, but not perfect," she said. "I missed one." "Did you?" He walked over to the boulder and picked up the remaining chip of stone. He glanced at it, then tossed it to her. She caught it with her left. Her right stayed near the holstered gun, he saw with approval. She shot better and more naturally than Eddie, but had not learned this particular lesson as swiftly as Eddie had done. If she had been with them during the shootout at Balazar's nightclub, she might have. Now, Roland saw, she was at least learning that too. She looked at the stone and saw the notch, barely a 16th of an inch deep in its upper corner. "You only clipped it," Roland said, returning to her, "but in a shooting scrape. Sometimes that's all you need. If you clip a fellow, throw his aim off." He paused. "Why are you looking at me that way?" "You don't know, do you? You really don't." "No. Your mind is often closed to me, Susanna." There was no defensiveness in his voice, and Susanna shook her head in exasperation. The rapid turn and turn-about dance of her personality sometimes unnerved him. His seeming inability to say anything other than exactly what was on his mind never failed to do the same to her. He was the most literal man she had ever met. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you why I'm looking at you that way, Roland. Because what you did was a mean trick. You said you wouldn't slap me, couldn't slap me, even if I cut up rough. But either you lied or you're very stupid. And I know you ain't stupid. People don't always slap with their hands, as every man and woman of my race could testify. We have a little rhyme where I come from. Sticks and stones will break my bones, yet taunts shall never wound me," Roland finished. Well, that's not exactly the way we say it, but I guess it's close enough. It's bullshit, no matter how you say it. They don't call what you did a tongue lashing for nothing. Your words hurt me, Roland. Are you going to stand there and say you didn't know that they would? She sat in her chair, looking up at him with bright, stern curiosity, and Roland thought not for the first time that the Hogmuffas of Susanna's land must have been either very brave or very stupid to cross her, wheelchair or no wheelchair. And having walked among them, he didn't think bravery was the answer. I did not think or care about your hurt, he said patiently. I saw you show your teeth and knew you meant to bite, so I put a stick in your jaws. And it worked, didn't it? Her expression was now one of hurt astonishment. You bastard! Instead of replying, he took the gun from her holster, fumbled the cylinder open with the remaining 2 fingers of his right hand, and began to reload the chambers with his left. Of all the high-handed, arrogant you needed to bite, he said in that same patient tone. Had you not, you would have shot all wrong, with your hand and your gun instead of your eye and your mind and your heart. Was that a trick? Was it arrogant? I think not. I think, Susanna, that you were the one with arrogance in her heart. I think you were the one with the mind to get up to tricks. That doesn't distress me, quite the opposite. A gunslinger without teeth is no gunslinger. Damn it! I'm not a gunslinger. He ignored that. He could afford to. If she was no gunslinger, then he was a Billy Bumbler. If we were playing a game, I might have behaved differently. But this is no game. His good hand went to his forehead for a moment and paused there, fingers tented just above the left temple. The tips of the fingers, she saw, were trembling minutely. Roland, what's ailing you? She asked quietly. The hand lowered slowly. He rolled the cylinder back into place and replaced the revolver in the holster she wore. Nothing. Yes, there is. I've seen it. Eddie has too. It started almost as soon as we left the beach. It's something wrong, and it's getting worse. There is nothing wrong, he repeated. She put her hands out and took his. Her anger was gone, at least for the time being. She looked earnestly up into his eyes. Eddie and I. This isn't our world, Roland. Without you, we'd die here. We'd have your guns and we can shoot them. You've taught us to do that well enough, but we'd die just the same. We depend on you. So tell me what's wrong. Let me try to help. Let us try to help. He had never been a man who understood himself deeply or cared to. The concept of self-consciousness, let alone self-analysis, was alien to him. His way was to act, to quickly consult his own interior, utterly mysterious workings, and then act. Of them all, he had been the most perfectly made, a man whose deeply romantic core was encased in a brutally simple box which consisted of instinct and pragmatism. He took one of those quick looks inside now and decided to tell her everything. There was something wrong with him. Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. Something wrong with his mind. Something as simple as his nature and as strange as the weird, wandering life into which that nature had impelled him. He opened his mouth to say, I'll tell you what's wrong, Susanna, and I'll do it in just 3 words. I'm going insane. But before he could begin, another tree fell in the forest. It went with a huge, grinding crash. This tree fall was closer, and this time they were not deeply engaged in a test of wills masquerading as a lesson. Both heard it. Both heard the agitated cawing of the crows which followed it, and both registered the fact that the tree had fallen close to their camp. Susanna had looked in the direction of the sound, but now her eyes, wide and dismayed, returned to the gunslinger's face. Eddie, she said. A cry rose from the deep green vastness of the woods in back of them. A vast cry of rage. Another tree went, and then another. They fell in what sounded like a hail of mortar fire. Dry wood, the gunslinger thought. Dead trees. Eddie, this time she shrieked it, or she screamed it. Whatever it is, it's near Eddie. Her hands flew to the wheels of her chair, and she began the laborious job of turning it around. No time for that. Roland seized her under her arms and pulled her free. He had carried her before when the going was too rough for the wheelchair. Both men had. But she was still amazed by his uncanny, ruthless speed. At one moment she was in her wheelchair, an item which had been purchased in New York City's finest medical supply house in the fall of 1962. At the next, she was balanced precariously on Roland's shoulders. Where did it go? Sorry, I lost my place. Oh, like a cheerleader, her muscular thighs gripping the sides of his neck, his palms over his head and pressing into the small of her back. He had begun to run with her, his sprung boots slapping the needle-strewn earth between the ruts left by her wheelchair. Odetta, he cried, reverting in this moment of stress to the name by which he had first known her. Don't lose the gun, for your father's sake. He was sprinting between the trees now. Shadow lace and bright trains of sundapple ran across them in moving mosaics as Roland lengthened his stride. They were going downhill now. Susanna raised her left hand to ward off a branch that wanted to slap her from the gunslinger's shoulders. At the same moment, she dropped her right hand to the butt of his ancient revolver, cradling it. A mile, she thought. How long to run a mile? How long with him going flat out like this? Not long, if he can keep his feet on these slippery needles, but maybe too long. Let him be all right. Lord, let my Eddie be all right. As if in answer, she heard the unseen beast loose its cry again. The vast voice was like thunder, like doom. One moment, let me check on the dogs. He was the largest creature in the forest, which had once been known as the Great West Woods, and he was the oldest. Many of the huge old elms which Roland had noticed in the valley below had been little more than twigs sprouting from the ground when the bear came out of the dim, unknown reaches of outer world, like a brutal, wandering king. Once, the old people who had lived in the West Woods, it was their leavings which Roland had found from time to time during the last weeks, and they had gone in fear of the colossal, undying bear. They had tried to kill him when they first discovered they were not alone in the new territory to which they had come, but although their arrows enraged him, they did no serious damage. And he was not confused about the source of his torment, as were the other beasts of the forest. Even the predatory bush cats, which denned and littered in the sand hills to the west. No, he knew where the arrows came from. This bear knew. And for every arrow which found its mark in the flesh below the shaggy pelt, he took 3, 4, perhaps as many as half a dozen of the old people. Children, if he could get them, women, if he could not. Their warriors he disdained, and this was the final humiliation. Eventually, as his real nature became clear to them, their efforts to kill him ceased. He was, of course, a demon incarnate, or the shadow of a god. They called him Mur, which to these people meant the world beneath the world. He stood 70 feet high, and after 18 or more centuries of undisputed rule in the West Woods, he was dying. Perhaps the instrument of his death had at first been a microscopic organism in something he had eaten or drunk. Perhaps it was old age. More likely a combination of both. The cause didn't matter. The ultimate result, a rapidly multiplying colony of parasites foraging within the fabulous brain, did. After years of calculating brutal sanity, Murr had run mad. The bear had known men were in the woods again. He ruled the forest, and although it was vast, nothing of importance which happened there escaped his attention for long. He had drawn away from the newcomers, not because he was afraid, but because he had no business with them, nor they with him. Then the parasites had begun their work, and as his madness increased, he became sure that it was the old people again, that the trap setters and forest burners had returned and would soon set about their old stupid mischief once more. Only, as he lay in his final den, some 30 miles from the place of the newcomers, sicker with each day's dawning than he had been at sunset the night before, had he come to believe that the old people had finally found some mischief which worked. Poison. He came this time not to take revenge for some petty wound, but to stamp them out entirely before their poison could finish having its way with them, and as he traveled, all thought ceased. What was left was red rage, the rusty buzz of the thing on top of his head, the turning thing between his ears which had once done its work in smooth silence, and an eerily enhanced sense of smell which led him unerringly toward the camp of the three pilgrims. One moment. The bear, whose real name was not Mur but something else entirely, made his way through the forest like a moving building, a shaggy tower with reddish brown eyes. Those eyes glowed with fever and madness. His huge head, now wearing a garland of broken branches and fir needles, swung ceaselessly from side to side. Every now and then he would sneeze in a muffled explosion of sound, and the clouds of squirming white parasites would be discharged from his dripping nostrils. His paws, armed with curved talons 3 feet in length, tore at the trees. He walked upright, sinking deep tracks in the soft black soil under the trees. He reeked of fresh balsam and old, sour shit. The thing on top of his head whirred and squealed and squealed and whirred. The course of the bear remained almost constant, a straight line which would lead him to the camp of those who had dared return to his forest, who had dared fill his head with dark green agony. Old people or new people, they would die. When he came to a dead tree, he sometimes left the straight path long enough to push it down. The dry, explosive roar of its fall pleased him. When the trees had finally collapsed its rotten length to the forest floor, or come to rest against one of its mates, the bear would push on through slanting bars of sunlight turned misty with floating motes of sawdust. 2 days before, Eddie Dean had begun carving again, the first time he'd tried to carve anything since the age of 12. He remembered that he'd enjoyed doing it, and he believed he must have been good at it as well. He couldn't remember that part, not for sure, but there was at least one clear indication that it was so. Henry, his older brother, had hated to see him doing it. "Oh, look at the sissy," Henry would say. "What you making today, sissy? A dollhouse? A piss pot for your itty teeny peeny. Oh, ain't that cute?" Henry would never come right out and tell Eddie not to do something. Would never just walk up to him and say, "Would you mind quitting that, bro? See, it's pretty good, and when you do something that's pretty good, it makes me nervous because you see, I'm the one that's supposed to be pretty good at stuff around here. Me, Henry Dean. So what I'll think I do, brother. So what I think I'll do, brother of mine, is just sort of rag on you about certain things. I won't come right out and say, 'Don't do that. It's making me nervous,' because that might make me sound you know, a little fucked up in the head, but I can rag on you because that's part of what big brothers do, right? All part of the image. I'll rag on you and tease you and make fun of you until you just fucking quit it, okay? Well, it wasn't okay. Not really, but in the Dean household, things usually went the way Henry wanted them to go. And until very recently, that had seemed right. Not okay, but right. There was a small but crucial difference there, if you could but dig it. There were two reasons why it seemed right. One was an on top reason, the other was an underneath reason. The on top reason was because Henry had to watch out for Eddie when Mrs. Dean was at work. He had to watch out all the time because once there had been a Dean's sister, if you could but dig it. She would have been 4 years older than Eddie and 4 years younger than Henry if she had lived. But that was the thing, you see, because she hadn't lived. She had been run over by a drunk driver when Eddie was 2. She had been watching a game of hopscotch on the sidewalk when it happened. As a kid, Eddie had sometimes thought of his sister while listening to Mel Allen doing the play-by-play on the Yankee Baseball Network. Someone would really pound one and Mel would bellow, "Holy cow, he got all of that one. See you later." Well, the drunk had gotten all of Gloria Dean. Holy cow, and see you later. Gloria was now in that great upper deck in the sky, and it had not happened because she was unlucky or because the state of New York had decided not to jerk the jerk's license after his third OUI, or even because God had bent down to pick up a peanut. It had happened, as Mrs. Dean frequently told her sons, because there had been no one around to watch out for Gloria. Henry's job was to make sure that nothing like that ever happened to Eddie. That was his job, and he did it. But it wasn't easy. Henry and Mrs. Dean agreed on that, if nothing else. Both of them frequently reminded Eddie of just how much Henry had sacrificed to keep Eddie safe from drunk drivers and muggers and junkies and possibly even malevolent aliens who might be cruising around in the general vicinity of the upper deck. Uh, in aliens who might decide to come down from their UFOs on nuclear-powered jet skis at any time in order to kidnap little kids like Eddie Dean. So it was wrong to make Henry more nervous than this terrible responsibility had already made him. If Eddie was doing something that did make Henry more nervous, Eddie ought to cease doing that thing immediately. It was a way of paying Henry back for all the time Henry had spent watching out for Eddie. When you thought about it that way, you saw that doing things better than Henry could do them was very unfair. Then there was the underneath reason. That reason, the world beneath the world, one might say, was more powerful, because it could never be stated. Eddie could not allow himself to be better than Henry at much of anything, because Henry was, for the most part, good for nothing. Except watching out for Eddie, of course. Henry taught Eddie how to play basketball in the playground near the apartment building where they lived. This was in a cement suburb where the towers of Manhattan stood against the horizon like a dream, and the welfare check was king. Eddie was 8 years younger than Henry and much smaller, but he was also much faster. He had a natural feel for the game. Once, he got on the cracked, hilly cement of the court. With the ball in his hands, the moves seemed to sizzle in his nerve endings. He was faster, but that was no big deal. The big deal was this: he was better than Henry. If he hadn't known it from the result of the pickup games in which they sometimes played, he would have known it from Henry's thunderous looks and the hard punches to the upper arm Henry often dealt on their way home afterwards. Those punches were supposedly Henry's little jokes. 2 for flinching, Henry would cry cheerily, and then whap, whap into Eddie's bicep with one knuckle extended. But they didn't feel like jokes. They felt like warnings. They felt like Henry's way of saying, "You better not fake me out and make me look stupid when you drive for the basket, bro. You better remember that. I'm watching out for you. The same was true with reading, baseball, ring a levio, math, even jump rope, which was a girl's game. That he was better at these things or could be better was a secret that had to be kept at all costs, because Eddie was the younger brother, because Henry was watching out for him. But the most important part of the underneath reason was also the simplest. These things had to be kept secret because Henry was Eddie's big brother, and Eddie adored him. 2 days ago, while Susanna was skinning out a rabbit and Roland was starting supper, Eddie had been in the forest just south of camp. He had seen a funny spur of wood jutting out of a fresh stump. Weird feeling, he supposed it was the one people called deja vu, swept over him, and he found himself staring fixedly at the spur, which looked like a badly shaped doorknob. He was distantly aware that his mouth had gone dry. After several seconds, he realized he was looking at the spur sticking out of the stump, but thinking about the courtyard behind the building where he and Eddie had lived, thinking about the feel of the warm cement under his ass and the whopping smells of garbage from the dumpster around the corner in the alley. In his memory, he had a chunk of wood in his left hand and a paring knife from the drawer by the sink in his right. The chunk of wood jutted from the stump had called up a memory of that brief period when he had fallen violently in love with wood carving. It was just the memory was buried so deep he hadn't realized, at first, what it was. What he had loved most about carving was the seeing part, which happened even before you began. Sometimes you saw a cart or a truck, sometimes a dog or a cat. Once, he remembered, it had been the face of an idol, one of the spooky Easter Island monoliths he had seen in an issue of National Geographic at school. That had turned out to be a good one. The game was to find out how much of that thing you could get out of the wood without breaking it. You could never get it all. But if you were very careful, you could sometimes get quite a lot. There was something inside the boss on the side of the stump. He thought he might be able to release quite a lot of it with Roland's knife. It was the sharpest, handiest tool he had ever used. Something inside the wood waited patiently for someone like him, to come along and let it out, set it free. Oh, look at this, sissy. What you making today, sissy? A dollhouse, a piss pot for your itty bitty teeny peeny, a slingshot, so you can pretend to hunt rabbits just like the big boys. Aw, ain't that cute? He felt a burst of shame, a sense of wrongness, that strong sense of secrets that must be kept at any cost, and then he remembered, again, that Henry Dean, who had in his later years become the great sage and eminent junkie, was dead. This realization had still not lost its power to surprise. It kept hitting him in different ways, sometimes with sorrow, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with anger. On this day, 2 days before the great bear came charging out of the green corridors of the woods, it had hit him in the most surprising way of all. He had felt relief and a soaring joy. He was free. Eddie had borrowed Roland's knife. He used it to cut carefully around the jutting boss of wood, then brought it back and sat beneath a tree with it, turning it this way and that. He was not looking at it. He was looking into it. Susanna had finished with her rabbit. The meat went into the pot over the fire. The skin she stretched between two sticks, tying it with hanks of rawhide from Roland's purse. Later on, after the evening meal, Eddie would begin scraping it clean. She used her hands and arms, slipping effortlessly over to where Eddie was sitting with his back propped against the tall old pine. At the campfire, Roland was crumbling some arcane, and no doubt delicious, wood herbs into the pot. What's doing, Eddie? Eddie had found himself restraining an absurd urge to hide the boss of wood behind his back. Nothing, he said. Thought I might, carve something. He paused, then added, I'm not very good, though. He sounded as if he might be trying to reassure her of this fact. She had looked at him, puzzled. For a moment she seemed on the verge of saying something, then simply shrugged and left him alone. She had no idea why Eddie seemed ashamed to be passing a little time whittling. Her father had done it all the time. But if it was something that needed to be talked about, she supposed Eddie would get to it in his own time. He knew the guilty feelings were stupid and pointless, but he also knew he felt more comfortable doing this work when Roland and Susanna were out of camp. Old habits, it seemed, sometimes died hard. Beating heroin was child's play compared to beating your childhood. When they were away, hunting or shooting or keeping Roland's particular form of school, Eddie found himself able to turn to his piece of wood with surprising skill and increasing pleasure. The shape was in there all right. He he had been right about that, and it was a simple one. And Roland's knife was setting it free with an eerie ease. Eddie thought he was going to get almost all of it, and that meant the slingshot might actually turn out to be a practical weapon. Not much compared to Roland's big revolvers, maybe, but something he had made himself just the same. His. And this idea pleased him very much. When the first crows rose in the air, cawing affrightedly, he did not hear. He was already thinking, hoping, that he might see a tree with a bow trapped in it before too long. He heard the bear approaching before Roland and Susanna did, but not much before. He was lost in that high daze of concentration which accompanies the creative impulse at its sweetest and most powerful. He had suppressed these impulses for most of his life, and now this one held him wholly in its grip. Eddie was a willing prisoner. He was pulled from his daze, not by the sound of falling trees, but by the rapid thunder of a 45 from the south. He looked up, smiling, and brushed hair from his forehead with a sawdusty hand. In that moment, sitting with his back against a tall pine in the clearing, which had become home, his face crisscrossed with opposing beams of green gold forest light, he looked handsome indeed, a young man with unruly dark hair which constantly tried to spill across his high forehead, a young man with a strong, mobile mouth and hazel eyes. For a moment, his eyes shifted to Roland's other gun, hanging by its belt from a nearby branch, and he found himself wondering how long it had been since Roland had gone anywhere without it, at least one of his fabulous weapons hanging by his side. That question led to two others. How old was he? This man who had plucked Eddie and Susanna from their world and their wens, and more important, what was wrong with him? Susanna had promised to broach that subject if she shot well and didn't get Roland's back hair up, that was. Eddie didn't think Roland would tell her. Not at first, but it was time to let old Long, Tall, and Ugly know that they knew something was wrong. There'll be water if God wills it, Eddie said. He turned back to his carving with a little smile playing on his lips. They had both begun to pick up Roland's little sayings, and he theirs. It was almost as if they were halves of the same. Then a tree fell close by in the forest. Eddie was on his feet in a second, the half-carved slingshot in one hand, Roland's knife in the other. He stared across the clearing in the direction of the sound, heart thumping, all his senses finally alert. Something was coming. Now he could hear it, trampling its heedless way through the underbrush, and he marveled bitterly that this realization had come so late. Far back in his mind, a small voice told him this is what he got. This is what he got for doing something better than Henry, for making Henry nervous. Another tree fell with a ratcheting, coughing crash. Looking down a ragged aisle between the tall firs, Eddie saw a cloud of sawdust rise in the still air. The creature responsible for that cloud suddenly bellowed a raging, gut-freezing sound. It was one huge motherfucker, whatever it was. He dropped the chunk of wood, then flipped Roland's knife at a tree 15 feet to his left. It somersaulted twice in the air and then struck halfway up to the hilt in the wood, quivering. He grabbed Roland's 45 from the place where it hung and cocked it. Stand or run? But he discovered he no longer had the luxury of that question. The thing was fast, as well as huge, and it was now too late to run. A gigantic shape began to disclose itself in that aisle of trees north of the clearing, a shape which towered above all but the tallest trees. It was lumbering directly toward him as its eyes fixed upon Eddie Dean. It gave voice to another of those cries. "Oh man, I'm fucked," Eddie whispered as another tree bent, cracked like a mortar, then crashed to the forest floor in a cloud of dust and dead needles. Now he was lumbering straight toward the clearing where he stood. A bear the size of King Kong, its footfalls made the ground shake. "What will you do, Eddie?" Roland suddenly asked. "Think. It's the only advantage you have over yon beast. What will you do?" He didn't think he could kill it. Maybe with a bazooka, but probably not with the gunslinger's 45. He could run, but had an idea that the oncoming beast might be pretty fast when it wanted to be. He guessed the chances of ending up as jammed between the great bear's toes might be as high as 50-50. So which one was it going to be? Stand here and start shooting, or run like his hair was on fire and his ass was catching? It occurred to him that there was a third choice. He could climb. He turned toward the tree against which he had been leaning. It was a huge, hoary pine, easily the tallest tree in these parts of the woods. The first branch spread out over the forest floor in a feathery green fan above about 8 feet up. Eddie dropped the revolver's hammer and then jammed the gun into the waistband of his pants. He leaped for the branch, grabbed it, and did a frantic chin up behind him. The bear gave voice to another bellow as it burst into the clearing. The bear would have had him just the same, would have left Eddie Dean's guts hanging in the gaudy string from the lowest branches of the pine, if another one of those sneezing fits had not come on in that moment. It kicked the ashy remains of the campfire into a black cloud and then stood almost doubled over, huge front paws on its huge thighs, looking for a moment like an old man in a fur coat. An old man with a cold. It sneezed again and again. Achoo! Achoo! And clouds of parasites blew out of his muzzle. Hot urine flowed in a stream between its legs and hissed out the campfire's scattered embers. Eddie did not waste the few crucial extra moments he had been given. He went up the tree like a monkey on a stick, pausing only once to make sure the gunslinger's revolver was still seated firmly in the waistband of his pants. He was in terror, already halfway convinced that he was going to die. What else could he expect, now that Henry wasn't around to watch out for him? But a crazy laughter raved through his head just the same. Been treed, he thought. How about that, sports fans? Been treed by Bearzilla. The creature raised its head again, the thing turning between its ears, catching winks and flashes of sunlight as it did so, then charged Eddie's tree. It reached high with one paw and slashed forward, meaning to knock Eddie loose like a pine cone. The paw tore through the branch he was standing on just as he lunged upward to the next. The paw tore through one of his shoes as well, pulling it from his foot and sending it flying in two ragged pieces. That's okay, Eddie thought. You can have 'em both, Bear, if you want. Goddamn things were worn out anyway. The bear roared and lashed at the tree, cutting deep wounds in its ancient bark, wounds which bled clear resinous sap. Eddie kept on yanking himself up. The branches were thinning now, and when he risked a glance down, he stared directly into the bear's muddy eyes. Below its cocked head, the clearing had become a target with the scattered smudge of a campfire as its bullseye. "Missed me, you hairy Eddie began, and then the bear, its head still cocked back to look at him, sneezed. Eddie was immediately drenched in hot snot that was filled with thousands of small white worms. They wriggled frantically on his shirt, his forearms, his throat and face. Eddie screamed in mingled surprise and revulsion. He began to brush at his eyes and mouth, lost his balance, and just managed to hook an arm around the branch beside him in time. He held on and raked at his skin, wiping off as much of the wormy phlegm as he could. The bear roared and hit the tree again. The pine rocked like a mast in a gale, but the fresh claw marks which appeared were at least 7 feet below the branch on which Eddie's feet were planted. The worms were dying, he realized. Must have begun dying as soon as they left the infected swamps inside the monster's body. It made him feel a little better, and he began to climb again. He stopped 12 feet further up, daring to go no higher. The trunk of the pine, easily 8 feet in diameter at its base, was now no more than 18 inches through the middle. He had distributed his weight on 2 branches, but he could feel both of them bending springily beneath him. He had a crow's nest view of the forest and foothills to the west now spread out below him in an undulating carpet. Under other circumstances, it might have been a view to relish. Top of the world, Ma, he thought. He looked down into the bear's upturned face again, and for a moment all coherent thought was driven from his mind by simple amazement. There was something growing out of the bear's skull, and to Eddie it looked like a small radar dish. The gadget turned jerkily, kicking up flashes of sun as it did, and Eddie could hear it screaming thinly. He had owned a few old cars in his time, the kind that sat in the used car lots with the words Handyman Special soaped on the windshields, and he thought the sound coming from the gadget was like the sound of bearings which will freeze up if they are not replaced soon. The bear uttered a long, purring growl, yellowish foam thick with worms squeezed between its paws in curdled goblets. He had never looked into the face of utter lunacy, and he supposed he had, having been eyeball to eyeball with the world-class bitch Detta Walker on more than one occasion. Eddie was looking into it now. But that face was, thankfully, a good 30 feet below him, and at their highest reach, those killing talons were 15 feet under the soles of his feet. And unlike the trees upon which the bear had vented its spleen as it approached the clearing, this one was not dead. Mexican standoff, honey, Eddie panted. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with one sap-sticky hand and flicked the mess down into the bugbear's face. Then the creature the old people had called Myrrh embraced the tree with its great forepaws and began to shake it. Eddie grabbed the trunk and held on for dear life, eyes squeezed into grim slits as the pine began to sway back and forth like a pendulum. Roland halted at the edge of the clearing. Susanna, perched on his shoulders, stared unbelievingly across the open space. The creature stood at the base of the tree where Eddie had been when the two of them left the clearing 45 minutes ago. She could see only chunks and sections of its body through the screen of branches and dark green needles. Roland's other gun belt lay beside one of the monster's feet. The holster, she saw, was empty. My God, she murmured. The bear screamed like a distraught woman and began shaking the tree. The branches lashed as if it were in a high wind. Her eyes skated upward and saw a dark form near the top. Eddie was hugging the trunk of the tree as the tree rocked and rolled. As she watched, one of his hands slipped and flailed wildly for purchase. What do we do? She screamed at Roland. It's going to shake him loose. What do we do? Roland tried to think about it, but the queer sensation had returned again. It was always with him now, but stress seemed to make it worse. He felt like 2 men existing inside one skull. Each man had his own set of memories, and when they began to argue, each insisting that his memories were the true ones, the gunslinger felt as if he were being ripped in two. He made a desperate effort to reconcile these two halves and succeeded, at least for the moment. It was one of the 12, he shouted. One of the guardians. Must be, but I thought they were. The bear bellowed up at Eddie again. Now it began to slap at the tree like a punchy fighter. Branches snapped and fell around its feet in a tangle. What? Susanna screamed. What's the rest? Roland closed his eyes. Inside his head a voice shouted, the boy's name was Jake. Another voice shouted back, there was no boy. There was no boy, and you know it. Get away, both of you, he snarled, and then called out loud. Shoot it! Shoot it in the ass, Susanna. It'll turn and charge. When it does, look for something on its head. The bear squalled again. It gave up slapping the tree and went back to shaking it. Ominous popping, grinding sounds were now coming from the upper part of the trunk. When he could be heard again, Roland shouted, I think it looks like a hat, a little steel hat. Shoot it, Susanna, and don't miss. Terror suddenly filled her. Terror and another emotion, one she would never have expected. Crushing loneliness. No, I'll miss. You do it, Roland. She began to fumble his revolver out of the belt she wore, meaning to give it to him. Can't, Roland shouted. The angle's bad. You have to do it, Susanna. This is the real test, and you'd better pass it. Roland, it means to snap the top of the tree off, he roared at her. Can't you see that? She looked at the revolver in her hand, looked across the clearing at the gigantic bear obscured in the clouds and sprays of green needles, looked at Eddie swaying back and forth like a metronome. Eddie probably had Roland's other gun, but Susanna could see no way he could use it without being shaken from his perch like an overripe plum. Also, he might not shoot at the right thing. She raised the revolver. Her stomach was thick with dread. Hold me still, Roland, she said. If you don't worry about me. She fired twice, squeezing the shots as Roland had taught her. The heavy reports cut across the sound of the bear shaking the tree like the cracks of a bullwhip. She saw both bullets strike home in the left cheek of the bear's rump, less than 2 inches apart. It shrieked in surprise, pain, and outrage. One of its huge front paws came out of the dense screen of branches and needles and slapped at the hurt's place. The hand came away dripping scarlet and rose back out of sight. Susanna could imagine it up there, examining its bloody palm. Then there was a rushing, rustling, snapping sound as the bear turned, bending down at the same time, dropping to all fours in order to achieve maximum speed. For the first time she saw its face, and her heart quailed. Its muzzle was lathered with foam. Its huge eyes glared like lamps. Its shaggy head swung to the left, back to the right, and centered upon Roland, who stood with his legs apart and Susanna Dean balanced on his shoulders. With a shattering roar, the bear charged. Say your lesson, Susanna Dean, and be true. The bear came at them in a rumbling lope. It was like watching a runaway factory machine over which someone had thrown a huge, moth-eaten rug. It looked like a hat, a little steel hat. She saw it, but it didn't look like a hat to her. It looked like a radar dish, a much smaller version of the kind she had seen in movie-tone newsreel stories about how the Dew Lines was keeping everyone safe from a Russian sneak attack. It was bigger than the pebbles she had shot off the boulder earlier, but the distance was greater. Sun and shadow ran across it in deceiving dapples. I do not aim with my hand. She who aims with her hand has forgotten the face of my father. I can't do it. I do not aim with my hand. I do not shoot with my hand. She who shoots with her hand has forgotten the face of her father. I'll miss. I know I'll miss. I do not kill with my gun. She who kills with her gun. Shoot it, Roland roared. And Susanna, shoot it. With the trigger as yet unpulled, she saw the bullet go home, guided from the muzzle to the target by nothing more or less than her heart's fierce desire that it should fly true, and all fear fell away. What was left was a feeling of deep coldness, and she had time to think, this is what he feels. My God, how does he stand it? I kill with my heart, motherfucker, she said, and the gunslinger's revolver roared in her hand. Sorry, the dog's being extra right now. One sec. The silvery thing spun on a steel rod planted in the bear's skull. Susanna's bullet struck it dead center, and the radar dish blew into 100 glittering fragments. The pole itself was suddenly engulfed in a burst of crackling blue fire which reached out in a net and seemed to grasp the sides of the bear's face for a moment. It rose on its rear legs with a whistling howl of agony, its front paws boxing aimlessly in the air. It turned in a wide, staggering circles and began to flap its arms as if it had decided to fly away. It tried to roar again, but what came out instead was a weird warbling sound like an air raid siren. It is very it is very well. Roland sounded exhausted. Good shot, fair and true. Should I shoot it again? She asked uncertainly. The bear was still blundering around in its mad circle, but now its body had begun to tilt sideways and inwards. It struck a small tree, rebounded, almost fell over, and then began to circle again. No need, Roland said. She felt his hand grip her waist and lift her. A moment later, she was sitting on the ground with her thighs folded beneath her. Eddie was slowly and shakily descending the pine, but she didn't see him. She could not take her eyes from the bear. She had seen the whales at the Seaquarium near Mystic, Connecticut, and believed they had been bigger than this. Much bigger, probably, but this was certainly the largest land creature she had ever seen, and it was clearly dying. Its roars had become liquid, bubbling sounds, and although its eyes were open, it seemed blind. It flailed aimlessly about the camp, knocking over a rack of curing hides, stamping flat the little shelter that she shared with Eddie. Chrome, what? I lost my place. Sorry. I got distracted by one of the dogs. Uh, It flailed aimlessly about the camp, knocking over a rack of curing hides, stamping flat the little shelter she shared with Eddie, caroming off trees. She could see the steel post rising from its head. Tendrils of smoke were rising around it, as if her shot had ignited its brains. Eddie reached to the lowest branch of the tree which had saved his life and sat shakily astride it. Holy Mary, Mother of God, he said. I'm looking right at it, and I still don't believe. The bear wheeled back toward him. Eddie leaped nimbly from the tree and streaked toward Susanna and Roland. The bear took no notice. It marched drunkenly to the pine, which had been Eddie's refuge, and tried to grasp it, failed, and sank to its knees. Now they could hear other sounds coming from inside it, sounds that made Eddie think of some huge truck engine stripping its gears. The spasm convulsed it, bowed its back. Its front claws rose and gored madly at its own face. Worm-infested blood flew and splattered, then it fell over, making the ground tremble with its fall, and lay still. After all its strange centuries, the bear the old people had called Mur, the world beneath the world, was dead. Eddie picked Susanna up, held her with his sticky hands locked together at the small of her back, and kissed her deeply. He reeked of sweat and pine tar. She touched his cheeks and his neck. She ran her hands through his wet hair. She felt an insane urge to touch him everywhere until she was absolutely sure of his reality. It almost had me, he said. It was like being on some crazy carnival ride. What a shot! Jesus, Suze, what a shot! I hope I never have to do anything like that again, she said. But a small voice at the center of her demurred. That voice suggested that she could not wait to do something like that again, and it was cold, that voice. Cold. What was, he began, turning toward Roland, but Roland was no longer standing there. He was walking slowly toward the bear, which now lay on the ground with its shaggy knees up. From within it came a series of muffled gasps and gurgles as its strange guts continued to slowly run down. Roland saw his knife planted deep in a tree near the scarred veteran that had saved Eddie's life. He pulled it free and wiped it clean on the soft deer shirt which had replaced the tatters he had been wearing when the three of them had left the beach. He stood by the bear, looking down at it with an expression of pity and wonder. Hello, stranger, he thought. Hello, old friend. I never believed in you. Not really. I believe Elaine did, and I know that Cuthbert did. Cuthbert believed in everything. But I was the hard-headed one. I thought you were only a tale for children. Another wind which blew around in my old nurse's hollow head before finally escaping her jabbering mouth. But you were here all along. Another refugee of the old times, like the pump at the way station and the old machine under the mountains, are the slow mutants who worship those broken remnants, the final descendants of the people who once lived in this forest and finally fled your wrath. I don't know. We'll never know, but it feels right. Yes, and then I came with my friends, my deadly old friends. We came, weaving our magic circle around us and around everything we touch, strand by poisonous strand, and now here you lie, at our feet. The world has moved on again, and this time, old friend, it is you who have been left behind. The monster's body still radiated a deep, sick heat. Parasites were leaving its mouth in tattered nostrils in hordes, but they died almost at once. Waxy white piles of them were growing on either side of the bear's head. Eddie approached slowly. He had shifted Susanna over to one hip, carrying her as a mother might carry a baby. What was it, Roland? Do you know? He called it a guardian, I think, Susanna said. Yes. Roland's voice was slow with amazement. I thought they were all gone. Must be all gone if they ever existed outside the old wives' tales in the first place. Whatever it was one crazy mother, Eddie said. Roland smiled a little. If you lived two or three thousand years, you'd be a crazy mother too. 2 or 3 thousand? Christ. Susanna said, Is it a bear? Really? And what's that? She pointed at what appeared to be a square metal tag set high on one of the bear's thick rear legs. It was almost overgrown with tough tangles of hair, but the afternoon sun had pricked out a single star point of light on the stainless steel surface, revealing it. Eddie knelt and reached hesitantly toward the tag, aware that the strange muffled clicks and clacks were still coming from deep inside the fallen giant. He looked at Roland. Go ahead, the gunslinger told him. It's finished. Eddie pushed a clump of hair aside and leaned closer. Words had been stamped into the metal. They were quite badly eroded, but he found that with a little effort he could read them. North Central Positronics Ltd., Granite City, Northeast Corridor. Design 4, Guardian. Serial number AA24123CX 755-431297L14. Type Species Bear. Shardik. NR. Subnuclear cells must not be replaced. NR. Holy Jesus! This thing is a robot, Eddie said softly. It can't be, Susanna said. When I shot it, it bled. Maybe so, but your ordinary garden variety bear doesn't have a radar dish growing out of its head, and so far as I know, your ordinary garden variety bear doesn't live to be 2 or 3. He broke off suddenly, looking at Roland. When he spoke again, his voice was revolted. Roland, what are you doing? Roland did not reply. Did not need to reply. What he was doing, gouging out one of the bear's eyes with his knife, was perfectly obvious. The surgery was quick, neat, and precise. When it was completed, he balanced an oozing brown ball of jelly on the blade of his knife for a moment, then flicked it aside. A few more worms made their way out of the staring hole, tried to squirm their way down from the bear's muzzle, and died. The gunslinger leaned over the eye socket of Shardik, the great guardian bear, and peered inside. Come and look, both of you, he said. I'll show you a wonder of the latter days. Put me down, Eddie, Susanna said. One moment. Put me down, Eddie, Susanna said. He did so, and she moved swiftly on her hands and upper thighs to where the gunslinger was hunkered down over the bear's wide, slack face. Eddie joined them, looking between their shoulders. The three of them gazed in rapt silence for nearly a full minute. The only noise came from the crows which still circled and scolded in the sky. Blood oozed from the socket in a few thick dying trickles, yet it was not just blood, Eddie saw. There was also a clear fluid which gave off an identifiable scent. Bananas. And embedded in the delicate crisscross of tendrils which shaped the socket, he saw a webwork of what looked like strings. Beyond blinking on and beyond them, at the back of the socket, was a red spark, blinking on and off. It illuminated a tiny square board marked with silvery squiggles of what could only be solder. It isn't a bear. It's a fucking Sony Walkman, he muttered. Susanna looked at him. What? Nothing. Eddie glanced at Roland. Do you think it's safe to reach in? Roland shrugged. I think so. If there was a demon in this creature, it's fled. Eddie reached in with his little finger, nerves set to draw back if he felt even a tickle of electricity. He touched the cooling meat inside the eye socket, which was nearly the size of a baseball, and then one of those strings. Except it wasn't a string. It was a gossamer thin strand of steel. He withdrew his finger and saw the tiny red spark blink once more before going out forever. Shardik, Eddie murmured. I know that name, but I can't place it. Does it mean anything to you, Suze? She shook her head. The thing is, Eddie laughed helplessly, I associate it with rabbits. Isn't that nuts? Roland stood up. His knees popped like gunshots. We'll have to move camp, he said. The ground here is spoiled. The other clearing, the one where we go to shoot, will... He took 2 trembling steps and then collapsed to his knees, palms pressed to the sides of his sagging head. Eddie and Susanna exchanged a single frightened glance, and then Eddie leaped to Roland's side. What is it, Roland? What's wrong? There was a boy, the gunslinger said in a distant muttering voice, and then in the very next breath, there wasn't a boy. Roland? Susanna asked. She came to him, slipped an arm around his shoulders, felt him trembling. Roland, what is it? The boy, Roland said, looking at her with floating, dazed eyes. It's the boy. Always the boy. What boy? Eddie yelled frantically. What boy? Go then, Roland said. There are other worlds than these. And fainted. That night, the 3 of them sat around a huge bonfire Eddie and Susanna had built in the clearing Eddie called the shooting gallery. It would have been a bad place to camp in the winter time, open to the valley as it was, but for now it was fine. Eddie guessed that here in Roland's world, it was still late summer. The black vault of the sky arched overhead, speckled by what seemed to be whole galaxies. Almost straight ahead to the south, across the river of darkness, that was the valley, Eddie could see Old Mother rising above the distant unseen horizon. He glanced at Roland, who sat huddled by the fire with 3 skins wrapped around his shoulders despite the warmth of the night and the heat of the fire. There was an untouched plate of food by his side and a bone cradled in his hands. Eddie glanced back at the sky and thought of a story the gunslinger had told him, and Susanna on one of those long days they had spent moving away from the beach, through the foothills, and finally into these deep woods, where they had found a temporary refuge. Before time began, Roland said, Old Star and Old Mother had been young and passionate newlyweds. Then one day there had been a terrible argument. Old Mother, who in those long ago days had been known by her real name, which was Lydia, had caught Old Star, whose real name was Upon, hanging about a beautiful young woman named Cassiopeia. They'd had a real bang-up fight, those 2, a hair-pulling, eye-gouging, crockery-throwing fight. One of those thrown bits of crockery had become the earth. The smaller shard, the moon, in a coal from their kitchen stove, had become the sun. In the end the gods had stepped in, so Upon and Lydia might not, in their anger, destroy the universe before it was fairly begun. Cassiopeia, the saucy jade who caused the trouble in the first place. Yeah, right, it's always the woman, Susanna had said at this point. had been banished to a rocking chair made of stars forever and ever. Yet not even this had solved the problem. Lydia had been willing to try again, but Upon was stiff-necked and full of pride. Yeah, always blame the man, Eddie had grunted at this point. So they had parted, and now they look at each other in mingled hatred and longing from across the star-strewn wreckage of their divorce. And Upon and Lydia were 3 billion years gone, the gunslinger told them. They had become Old Star and Old Mother, the North and the South, each pining for each other, but both now too proud to beg for reconciliation, and Cassiopeia sits off to the side in her chair, rocking and laughing at them both. Eddie was startled by a soft touch on his arm. It was Susanna. Come on, she said. We've got to make him talk. Eddie carried her to the campfire and put her down carefully on Roland's right side. He sat on Roland's left. Roland looked first at Susanna, then at Eddie. How close you both sit to me, he remarked. Like lovers or warders in a goal. It's time for you to do some talking. Susanna's voice was low and clear and musical. If we're your companions, Roland, and it seems like we are, like it or not, it's time you started treating us as companions. Tell us what's wrong. And what we can do about it, Eddie finished. Roland sighed deeply. I don't know how to begin, he said. It's been so long since I've had companions, or a tale to tell. Start with the bear, Eddie said. Susanna leaned forward, touched the jawbone Roland held in his hands. Frightened her, but she touched it anyway, and finished with this. Yes, Roland lifted the bone to eye level and looked at it for a moment before dropping it back into his lap. We'll have to speak of this, won't we? It's the center of the thing. But the bear came first. This is the story I was told when I was a child, Roland said, when everything was new. The great old ones, they weren't gods, but people who had almost the knowledge of gods, created 12 guardians to stand watch at the 12 portals which lead in and out of the world. Sometimes I heard that these portals were natural things, like the constellations we see in the sky or the bottomless crack in the earth we called Dragon's Grave, because of the great burst of steam they gave off every 30 or 40 days. But other people, one I remember in particular, the head cook in my father's castle, a man named Hax, said they were not natural, that they had been created by the great old ones themselves in the days before they hanged themselves with pride like a noose and disappeared from the earth. Hax used to say that the creation of the 12 guardians was the last act of the great old ones, their attempt to atone for the great wrongs they had done to each other and to the earth itself. Portals, Eddie mused. Doors, you mean? We're back to those again. Do these doors that lead in and out of the world open on the world Susan and I came from, like the ones we found along the beach? I don't know, Roland said. For everything I do know, there are hundreds of things I don't. You, both of you, will have to reconcile yourselves to that fact. The world has moved on, we say. When it did, it went like a great receding wave, leaving only wreckage behind, wreckage that sometimes looks like a map. Well, make a guess, Eddie exclaimed, and the raw eagerness in his voice told the gunslinger that Eddie had not given up the idea of returning to his own world, and Susanna, even now, not entirely. Leave him be, Eddie, Susanna said. The man don't guess. Not true. Sometimes the man does, Roland said, surprising them both. When guessing's the only thing left. Sometimes he does. The answer is no. I don't guess that these portals are much like the doors on the beach. I don't guess they go to a where or when that we would recognize. I think the doors on the beach the ones that led into the world you both came from, were like the pivot at the center of a child's teeterboard. Do you know what that is? Seesaw? Susanna asked and tipped her hand back and forth to demonstrate. Yes, Roland agreed, looking pleased. Just so. On one end on one end of this saucy seesaw, Eddie said, smiling a little. Yes, on one end, my Ka, on the other, that of the man in black, Walter. The doors were center creations of the tension between two opposing destinies. These other portals are things far greater than Walter or me or the little fellowship we three have made. Are you saying, Susanna asked hesitantly, that the portals where these guardians stand, watch, are outside Ka? Beyond Ka? I'm saying that I believe so. He offered his own brief smile, the thin sickle in the firelight. That I guess so. He was silent a moment, then he picked up a stick of his own. He brushed away the carpet of pine needles and used the stick to draw in the dirt beneath. Okay, there's a circle, and there's 12 circles around the outside, or around the inside of the circle. So it looks like a clock. It looks like a clock, but instead of numbers, there's little X's. Well, I guess I'm going to have to show you this. Hold on. Can we see it at any point? Yeah, right here. Oh, okay, right there. There's that. And then we're going to get to this one in a... Dang it. Why won't it put there? And we're going to get to the second one in a minute where he draws the lines on them. Okay. Here is the world as I was told it existed when I was a child. The X's are the portals standing in a ring on its eternal edge. If one drew 6 lines connecting these portals in pairs, so... He looked up. Do you see where the lines cross in the center? Eddie felt goose flesh crawling up his back and down his arms. His mouth was suddenly dry. Is that it, Roland? Is that... Roland nodded. His long, lined face was grave. At this nexus lies the great portal, the so-called 13th gate, which rules not just this world, but all worlds. He tapped the center of the circle. Here is the Dark Tower, for which I've searched my whole life. The gunslinger resumed. At each of the 12 lesser portals, the great old ones set a guardian. In my childhood, I could have named them all in the rhymes my nursemaid and Hax, the cook, taught to me, but my childhood was long ago. There was the bear, of course, and the fish, the lion, the bat, and the turtle. He was an important one. The gunslinger looked up into the starry sky, his brow creased in deep thought. Then an amazingly sunny smile broke across his features, and he recited, See the turtle of enormous girth, on his shell he holds the earth. His thought is slow, but always kind. He holds us all within his mind. On his back all vows are made. He sees the truth, but mayn't aid. He loves the land and loves the sea, and even loves a child like me. Roland uttered a small, bemused laugh. Hax taught that to me, singing it as he stirred the frosting for some cake and gave me little nips of sweets from the edge of his spoon. Amazing what we remember, isn't it? Anyway, as I grew older, I came to believe that the guardians didn't really exist, that they were symbols rather than substance. It seems that I was wrong. I called it a robot, Eddie said, but that's not what it really was. Susanna's right. The only thing robots bleed when you shoot them is Quaker State 1040. I think it was what people of my world call a cyborg. A creature that's part machine, part flesh and blood. That was a movie I saw. We told you about movies, didn't we? Smiling a little, Roland nodded. Well, this movie was called RoboCop, and the guy in it wasn't a lot different from the bear Susanna killed. How'd you know where we should shoot it? That I remembered from the old tales as Hax told them. He said, if it had been up to my nursemaid, Eddie, you'd be in the belly of the bear now. Do they sometimes tell puzzled children in your world to put on their thinking caps? Yes, Susanna said. They sure do. It's said here as well, and the saying comes from the story of the guardians. Each supposedly carried an extra brain on the outside of its head, in a hat. He looked at them with his dreadfully haunted eyes and smiled again. Didn't look much like a hat, did it? No, Eddie said. But the story was close enough to save our bacon. I think now that I've been looking for one of the guardians ever since I began my quest, Roland said. When we find the portal this Shardik guarded, and that should only be a matter of following its back trail, we will finally have a course to follow. We must set the portal to our backs, then simply move straight ahead at the center of the circle. The tower. Eddie opened his mouth to say, "All right, let's talk about this tower. Finally, once and for all, let's talk about it. What is it, what it means, and most important of all, what happens to us when we get there." But no sound came out, and after a moment he closed his mouth again. This wasn't the time. Not now, with Roland in such obvious pain. Not now, with only the spark of their campfire to keep the night at bay. So now we come to the other part, Roland said heavily. I have finally found my course. After all the long years, I have found my course. But at the same time, I seem to be losing my sanity. I can feel it crumbling away beneath my feet like a steep embankment which has been loosened by rain. This is my punishment for letting a boy who never existed fall to his death. And that is also Ka. Who is the boy? Roland, Susanna asked. Roland glanced at Eddie. Do you know? Eddie shook his head. But I spoke of him, Roland said. In fact, I raved of him when the infection was at its worst and I was near dying. The gunslinger's voice suddenly rose half an octave, and his imitation of Eddie's voice was so good that Susanna felt a coil of superstitious fright. If you don't shut up about that goddamn kid, Roland, I'll gag you with your own shirt. I'm sick of hearing about him. Do you remember saying that, Eddie? Eddie thought it over carefully. Roland had spoken of thousands of things as the two of them made their tortuous way up the beach from the door marked "The Prisoner" to the one marked "The Lady of the Shadows." And he had mentioned what seemed like 1,000 names in his fever-heated monologues: Elaine, Court, Jamie de Curry, Cuthbert. This one, more often than the others. Hax, Martin, or perhaps Martin, like the animal. Walter, Susan, even a guy with the unlikely name of Zoltan. Eddie had gotten very tired of hearing about these people he had never met and didn't care to meet. But of course, Eddie had a few problems of his own at that time, heroin withdrawal and cosmic jet lag being only two of them. And if he was to be fair, he guessed Roland had gotten as tired of Eddie's own fractured fairy tales, the ones about how he and Henry had grown up together and turned into junkies together, as Eddie had of Roland's. But he couldn't remember ever telling Roland he would gag him with his own shirt if he didn't stop talking about some kid. Nothing comes to you? Roland asked. Nothing at all? Was there something, some far off trickle like the feeling of deja vu he'd gotten when he saw the slingshot hiding inside the chunk of wood jutting out of the stump? Eddie tried to find that tickle, but it was gone. He decided it had never been there in the first place. He only wanted it to be there because Roland was hurting so badly. No, he said. Sorry, man. But I did tell you. Roland's tone was calm, but urgency ran and pulsed beneath it like a scarlet thread. The boy's name was Jake. I sacrificed him. Killed him in order that I might finally catch up to Walter and make him talk. I killed him under the mountains. On this point, Eddie could be more positive. Well, maybe that's what happened, but it's not what you said happened. You said you went under the mountains alone on some kind of crazy handcar. You talked about that a lot when you were coming up the beach, Roland, about how scary it was to be alone. I remember, but I also remember telling you about the boy and how he fell from the trestle into the chasm And it's the distance between those two memories that is pulling my mind apart. I don't understand any of this, Susanna said worriedly. I think, Roland said, that I'm just beginning to. He threw more wood on the fire, sending thick sheaves of red sparks spiraling up into the dark sky, and then settled back between them. I'll tell you a story that's true, he said, and then I'll tell you a story that isn't true, but should be. About a mule in Price Town, and when I finally got to Tull, the last town before the desert, it was still fresh. So the gunslinger embarked on the most recent part of his long tale. Eddie had heard isolated fragments of the story, but he listened in utter fascination, as did Susanna, for whom it was completely new. He told them about the bar with the endless game of Watch Me going on in the corner, the piano player named Sheb, the woman named Allie with the scar on her forehead, and about Nort, the weed eater who had died and then been brought back to some sort of tenebrous life by the man in black. He told them about Sylvia Pittston, the avatar of religious insanity, and about the final apocalyptic slaughter in which he, Roland the gunslinger, had killed every man, woman, and child in town. Holy crispy crap, Eddie said in a low, shaky voice. Now I know why you were so low on shells, Roland. Be quiet, Susanna snapped. Let him finish. Roland went on, telling his story as stolidly as he had crossed the desert after passing the hut of the last dweller, a young man whose wild, strawberry-colored hair had reached almost to his waist. He had told them about how his mule had finally died. He even told them about how the dweller's pet bird, Zoltan, had eaten the mule's eyes. He told them about the long desert days and the short desert nights which had come next, and how he had followed the cool remains of Walter's campfires, and how he had come at last, reeling and dying of dehydration, to the way station. It was empty. It had been empty, I think, since the days when yonder great bear was still a newly made thing. I stayed a night and pushed on. That's what happened. But now I'll tell you another story. The one that isn't true but should be? Susanna asked. Roland nodded. In this made-up story, this fable, a gunslinger named Roland met a boy named Jake at the way station. This boy was from your world, from your city of New York, and from a Wen someplace between Eddie's 1987 and Odetta Holmes' 1963. Eddie was leaning forward eagerly. Is there a door in this story, Roland? A door marked "The Boy" or something like that? Roland shook his head. The boy's doorway was death. He was on his way to school when a man I believed to be Walter, pushed him into the street where he was run over by a car. He heard this man say something like, "Get out of the way, let me through, I'm a priest." Jake saw this man, just for an instant, and then he was in my world. The gunslinger paused, looking into the fire. Now, I want to leave the story of the boy who was never there, and go back to what really happened for a minute, all right? Eddie and Susanna exchanged a puzzled glance, and then Eddie made an "after you, my dear" Alphonse gesture with his hands. As I have said, the way station was deserted. There was, however, a pump that still worked. It was at the back of the stable where the coach horses were kept. I followed my ears to it, but I would have found it even if it had been completely silent. I smelled the water, you see. After enough time in the desert, when you're on the edge of dying from thirst, you can really do that. I drank and then slept. When I woke, I drank again. I wanted to push on at once. The need to do that was like a fever. The medicine you brought me from your world, the Aston, is wonderful stuff, Eddie, but there are fevers beyond the power of any medicine to cure, and this was one of them. I knew my body needed rest, but it still took every ounce of my willpower to stay there even one night. In the morning, I felt rested, and so I refilled my water skins and pushed on. I took nothing from that place but water. That's the most important part of what really happened. Susanna spoke in her most reasonable, pleasant, and Odetta Holmes-like voice. All right, that's what really happened. You refilled your water skins and went on. Now tell us the rest of what didn't happen, Roland. The gunslinger put the jawbone in his lap for a moment, curled his hands into fist, and rubbed his eyes with them. Curiously childlike gesture. Then he grasped the jawbone again as if for courage, and went on. I hypnotized the boy who wasn't there, he said. I did it with one of my shells. It's a trick I've known for years, and I learned it from a very unlikely source. Martin, my father's court magician. The boy was a good subject. While he was tranced, he told me the circumstances of his death, as I've told them to you. When I'd gotten as much of his story as I felt I could without upsetting or actually hurting him, I gave him a command that he should not remember anything about his dying when he woke up again. Who'd want to? Eddie muttered. Roland nodded. Who indeed? The boy passed from his trance directly into a natural sleep. I also slept. When we woke, I told the boy that I meant to catch the man in black. He knew who I meant. Walter had also stopped at the way station. Jake was afraid and hid from him. I'm sure Walter knew he was there, but it suited his purpose to pretend he didn't. He left the boy behind like a set trap. I asked him if there was anything to eat there. It seemed to me there must be. He looked healthy enough, and the desert climate is wonderful when it comes to preserving things. He had a little dry meat, and he said there was a cellar. He hadn't explored that because he was afraid. The gunslinger looked at them grimly. He was right to be afraid. I found food, and I also found a speaking demon. Eddie looked down at the jawbone with widening eyes. Orange firelight danced on its ancient curves and hoodoo teeth. Speaking demon? Do you mean that thing? No, he said. Yes, both. Listen, and you shall understand. He told them about the inhuman groans he had heard coming from the earth beyond the cellar, how he had seen sand running from between two of the old blocks which made up the cellar walls. He told them of approaching the hole that was appearing there as Jake screamed for him to come up. He had commanded the demon to speak, and so the demon had. In the voice of Allie, the woman with the scar on her forehead, the woman who had kept the bar in Tull. Go slow past the drawers, gunslinger. While you travel with the boy, the man in black travels with your soul in his pocket. The drawers? Susanna asked, startled. Yes. Roland looked at her closely. That means something to you, does it? Yes and no. She spoke with great hesitation. Some of it, Roland divined, was simple reluctance to speak of things which were painful to her. He thought most of it, however, was a desire not to confuse issues which were already confused by saying more than she actually knew. He admired that. He admired her. Say what you can be sure of, he said, no more than that. All right. The drawers was a place Detta Walker knew about, a place Detta thought about. It was a slang term, one she picked up from listening to the grown-ups when they sat on the porch and drank beer and talked about the old days. It means a place that's spoiled, or useless, or both. There was something in the drawers, and the idea of the drawers, that called to Detta. Don't ask me what. I might have known once, but I don't anymore, and I don't want to. Detta stole my Aunt Blue's china plate, the one my folks gave her for a wedding present, and took it to the drawers, her drawers, to break it. That place was a gravel pit filled with trash, a dumping ground. Later on, she sometimes picked up boys at roadhouses. Susanna dropped her head for a moment, her lips pressed tightly together. Then she looked up again and went on. White boys. And when they took her back to their cars in the parking lot, she cock-teased them and then ran off. Those parking lots, they were like the drawers too. It was a dangerous game, but she was young enough, quick enough, and mean enough to play it to the hilt and enjoy it. Later, in New York, she'd go on shoplifting expeditions. You know about that, both of you. Always to the fancy stores, Macy's, Gimbel's, Bloomingdale's, and steal trinkets. And when she made up her mind to go on one of those sprees, she'd think, I'm going to the drawers today. Gonna steal me some shit from the white folks. Gonna steal me something for special, and then break that some bitch. She paused, lips trembling, looking into the fire. When she looked around again, Roland and Eddie saw her tears standing in her eyes. I'm crying, but don't let that fool you. I remember doing those things, and I remember enjoying them. I guess I'm crying because I know I'd do it all again if the circumstances were right. Roland seemed to have regained some of his old serenity, his weird equilibrium. We have a proverb in my country, Susanna. The wise thief always prospers. I don't see nothing wise about stealing a bunch of paste jewelry, she said sharply. Were you ever caught? No. He spread his hands as if to say, there you have it. So for Detta Walker, the drawers were bad places, Eddie asked. Is that right? Because it doesn't exactly feel right. Bad and good at the same time. They were powerful places, places where she reinvented herself, I suppose you could say. But they were lost places, too. And this is all off the subject of Roland's ghost boy, isn't it? Maybe not, Roland said. We had drawers as well, you see, in my world. It was slang for us, too, and the meanings are very similar. What did it mean to you and your friends? Eddie asked. That varied slightly from place to place and situation to situation. It might mean a trash midden, it might mean a whorehouse, or a place where men came to gamble or chew devilweed. But the most common meaning that I know is also the simplest. He looked at them both. The drawers are a place of desolation, he said. The drawers are the wastelands. This time, Susanna threw more wood on the fire. In the south, Old Mother blazed on brilliantly, not flickering. She knew from her school studies what that meant. It was a planet, not a star. Venus? She wondered. Or is the solar system of which this world is a part of as different as everything else? Again, that feeling of unreality, the feeling that all this must surely be a dream, washed over her. Go on, she said. What happened after the voice warned you about the drawers and the little boy? I punched my hand into the hole and the sand had come from, and as I was taught to do, if such a thing ever happened to me, what I plucked forth was a jawbone, but not this one. The jawbone I took from the wall of the way station was much longer, from one of the great old ones, I have almost no doubt. What happened to it? Susanna asked quietly. One night I gave it to the boy, Roland said. The fire painted his cheeks with hot orange highlights and dancing shadows, as a protection, a kind of talisman. Later I found it had served its purpose and threw it away. So whose jawbone you got there, Roland? Eddie asked. Roland held it up, looking at it long and thoughtfully, and let it drop back. Later, after he died, I caught up with the man I had been chasing. With Walter, Susanna said. Yes. We held palaver, he and I, long palaver. I fell asleep at some point, and when I woke up, Walter was dead. 100 years dead, at least, and probably more. There was nothing left of him but bones, which was fitting enough since we were in a place of bones. Yeah, it must have been a pretty long palaver, all right, Eddie said dryly. Susanna frowned slightly at this, but Roland only nodded. Long and long, he said, looking into the fire. You came to in the morning and reached the western sea that very evening, Eddie said. That night the Lobstrosities came, right? Roland nodded again. Yes, but before I left the place where Walter and I had spoken, or dreamed, or whatever it was we did, I took this from the skull of his skeleton. He lifted the bone in the orange light again and skated off the teeth. Walter's jawbone, Eddie thought, and felt a little chill work through him. The jawbone of the man in black. Remember this, Eddie, my boy. The next time you get to thinking Roland's maybe just another one of the guys, he's been carrying it around with him all this time like some kind of a cannibal's trophy. Jesus. I remember what I thought when I took it, Roland said. I remember very well. It was the only memory I have of that time which hasn't doubled on me. I thought, it was bad luck to throw away what I found when I found the boy. This will replace it. Only then I heard Walter's laughter. His mean, tittery laughter. I heard his voice, too. What did he say? Susanna asked. Too late, gunslinger, Roland said. That's what he said. Too late. Your luck will be bad from now until the end of eternity. That is your call. All right, Eddie said at last. I understand the basic paradox. Your memory is divided. Not divided. Doubled. All right. It's almost the same thing, isn't it? Eddie grasped a twig and made his own little drawing in the sand. He tapped the line on the left. This is your memory of the time before you got to the way station. A single track. Yes. He tapped the line on the right, and after you came out from the far side of the mountains in the place of bones, the place where Walter was waiting for you, also a single track. Yes. Now Eddie first indicated the middle area and then drew a rough circle around it. That's what you've got to do, Roland. Close this double track off. Build a stockade around it in your mind and then forget it. Because it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't change anything. It's gone. It's done. But it isn't. Roland held up the bone. If my memories of the boy Jake are false, and I know they are, how can I have this? I took it to replace the one I threw away, but the one I threw away came from the cellar of the way station along the track. I know it's true. I never went down cellar. I never spoke with the demon. I moved on alone with fresh water and nothing else. Roland, listen to me, Eddie said earnestly. If that jawbone you're holding was the one from the way station, that would be one thing. But isn't it possible that if you hallucinated that whole thing, the way station, the kid, the speaking demon, then maybe you took Walter's jawbone because it was no hallucination, Roland said. He looked at them both with his faded blue bombardier's eyes and then did something neither expected, something Eddie would have sworn Roland did not know he meant to do himself. He threw the jawbone into the fire. For a moment it only lay there, a white relic bent in a ghostly half-grin. Then it suddenly blazed red, washing the clearing with dazzling scarlet light. Eddie and Susanna cried out and threw their hands up to shield their eyes from the burning shape. The bone began to change. Not to melt, but to change. The teeth, which had leaned out of it like gravestones, began to draw together in clumps. The mild curve of the upper arc straightened, then snubbed down at the tip. Eddie's hand fell into his lap, and he stared at the bone, which was no longer a bone, with a gape-jawed wonder. It was now the color of burning steel. The teeth had become 3 inverted V's, the middle one longer than those on the ends, and suddenly Eddie saw what it wanted to become, just as he had seen the slingshot in the wood of the stump. He thought it was a key. You must remember the shape, he thought feverishly. You must, you must. His eyes traced it desperately. 3 V's, the one in the center longer and deeper than the two on the end, 3 notches, and the one closest to the end had a single squiggle, the shallow shape of a lowercase s. Then the shape in the flames changed again. The bone, which had become something like a key, drew inward, concentrating itself into a bright, overlapping petals and folds as dark and velvety as moonless summer midnight. For a moment Eddie saw a rose, a triumphant rose that might have bloomed in the dawn of this world's first day, a thing of depthless, timeless beauty. His eyes saw, and his heart was opened. It was as if all love and life had suddenly risen from Roland's dead artifact. It was there in the fire, burning out in triumph, then something wonderful, inchoate defiance, declaring that despair was a mirage and death a dream. The rose, he thought incoherently. First the key, then the rose. Behold, behold the opening of the way to the tower. There was a thick cough from the fire, a fan of sparks twisted outwards. Susanna screamed and rolled away, beating at orange flecks on her dress as the flames gushed upward toward the starry sky. Eddie didn't move. He sat transfixed in his vision, held in a cradle of wonder which was both generous and terrible, unmindful of the sparks which danced across his skin. Then the flames sank back. The bone was gone. The key was gone. The rose was gone. Remember, he thought. Remember the rose and remember the shape of the key. Susanna was sobbing with shock and terror, but he ignored her for the moment and found the stick with which he and Roland had both drawn, and in the dirt he made this shape with a shaking hand. Do we see it? Can we see it? Yep. Okay. Oh, 1 sec. Sorry. Sorry about that. I've been absolutely dying of thirst over here. Okay, one moment. Why did you do it? Susanna asked at last. Why, for God's sake, and what was it? 15 minutes had gone by. The fire had been allowed to burn low, the scattering embers had either been stamped out or had gone out on their own. Eddie sat with his arms about his wife. Susanna sat before him with her back against his chest. Roland was off to one side, knees hugged to his chest, looking moodily into the orange-red coals. So far as Eddie could tell, neither of them had seen the bone change. They had both seen it glowing super hot, and Roland had seen it explode, or had it imploded. To Eddie, that seemed closer to what he had seen. But that was all. Or so he believed. Roland, however, sometimes kept his own counsel, and when he decided to play his cards close to the vest, he played them very close indeed. Eddie knew that from bitter experience. He thought of telling them what he had seen, or thought he had seen, and decided to play his own cards tight and close up, at least for the time being. Of the jawbone itself there was no sign, not even a splinter. I did it because a voice spoke in my mind and told me I must, Roland said. It was the voice of my father, of all my fathers. When one hears such a voice, not to obey, and at once, is unthinkable. So I was taught. As to what it was, I can't say. Not now, at least. I only know that the bone has spoken its final word. I have carried it all this way to hear it. Or to see it, Eddie thought. And again, remember. Remember the rose, and remember the shape of the key. It was almost flat. It almost flash fried us. She sounded both tired and exasperated. Roland shook his head. I think it was more like the sort of firework the barons used to sometimes shoot into the sky at their year-end parties, bright and startling, but not dangerous. Eddie had an idea. The doubling in your mind, Roland. Is it gone? Did it leave when the bone exploded, or whatever it did? He was almost convinced that it had. In the movies he'd seen, such rough shock therapy almost always worked. But Roland shook his head. Susanna shifted in Eddie's arms. You said you were beginning to understand. Roland nodded. I think so, yes. If I'm right, I fear for Jake. Wherever he is, whenever he is, I fear for him. What do you mean? Eddie asked. Roland got up, went to his roll of hides, and began to spread them out. Enough stories and excitement for one night. It's time to sleep. In the morning, we'll follow the bear's back trail and see if we can find the portal he was set to guard. I'll tell you what I know and what I believe has happened. What I believe is happening still, along the way. With that, he wrapped himself in an old blanket and a new deerskin, rolled away from the fire, and would say no more. Eddie and Susanna lay down together. When they were sure the gunslinger must be asleep, they made love. Roland heard them going about it as he lay wakeful and heard their quiet after-love talk. Most of it was about him. He lay quietly, open eyes looking into the darkness long after their talk had ceased, and their breathing had evened out into a single easy note. It was, he thought, fine to be young and in love, even in the graveyard, which the world had become. It was fine. Enjoy it while you can, he thought, because there is more death ahead. We have come to a stream of blood. That it will lead us to a river of the same stuff, I have no doubt, and further along to an ocean. In this world the graves yawn, and none of the dead rest easy. As dawn began to come up in the east, he closed his eyes, slept briefly, and dreamed of Jake. Eddie also dreamed. Dreamed he was back in New York, walking along 2nd Avenue with a book in his hand. In this dream it was spring, the air was warm, the city was blooming, and homesickness sobbed within him like a mussel with a fishhook caught deep within it. Enjoy this dream and make it go on as long as you can, he thought. Savor it. Because this is as close to New York as you're going to get. You can't go home, Eddie. That part's done. He looked down at the book and was utterly unsurprised to find it was You Can't Go Home Again by Thomas Wolfe. Stamped into the dark red cover were 3 shapes: key, rose, and door. He stopped for a moment, flipped the book open, and read the first line. The man in black fled across the desert, Wolfe had written, and the gunslinger followed. Eddie closed it and walked on. It was about 9 in the morning, he judged, maybe 9:30, and traffic on 2nd Avenue was light. Taxis honked and wove their way from lane to lane with spring sunshine twinkling off the windshields and bright yellow paint jobs. A bum on the corner of the 2nd and 52nd asked him for a handout, and Eddie tossed the book with the red cover into his lap. He observed, also without surprise, that the bum was Enrico Balazar. He was sitting cross-legged in front of a magic shop, House of Cards. The sign in the window read, and the display inside showed a tower which had been built of tarot cards. Standing on top was a model of King Kong. There was a tiny radar dish growing out of the great ape's head. Eddie walked on, lazing his way downtown. The street signs floated past him. He knew where he was going as soon as he saw it. The small shop on the corner of 2nd and 46th. Yeah, he thought. A feeling of great relief swept through him. This is the place, the very place. The window was full of hanging meats and cheeses. Tom and Jerry's Artistic Deli, the sign read. Party platters, our specialty. As he stood looking in, someone else he knew came around the corner. It was Jack Angelini, wearing a three-piece suit the color of vanilla ice cream and carrying a black cane in his left hand. Half of his face was gone, lopped, lopped off by the claws of the lobstrosities. Go on in, Eddie, Jack said as he passed. After all, there are other worlds than these, and that fucking train rolls through all of them. I can't, Eddie replied. The door is locked. He didn't know how he knew this, but he did. Knew it beyond a shadow of a doubt. That a chum? That a chi? Not to worry. You've got the key, Jack said, not looking back. Eddie looked down and saw he did have a key. A primitive-looking thing with 3 notches like inverted V's. That little S shape at the end of the last notch is the secret, he thought. He stepped under the awning of Tom and Jerry's Artistic Deli and inserted the key in the lock. It turned easily. He opened the door and stepped through into a huge open field. He looked back over his shoulder and saw the traffic on 2nd Avenue hurrying by, and then the door slammed shut and fell over. There was nothing behind it. Nothing at all. He turned back to survey his new surroundings, and what he saw filled him with terror at first. The field was deep scarlet, as if some titanic battle had been fought here and the ground had been drenched with so much blood that it could not all be absorbed. Then he realized that it was not blood he was looking at, but roses. That feeling of mingled joy and triumph surged through him again, swelling his heart until he felt it might burst within him. He raised his clenched fists high over his head in a gesture of victory, and then froze that way. The field stretched on for miles, climbing a gentle slope of land, and standing at the horizon was the dark tower. It was a pillar of dumb stone rising so high into the sky that he could barely discern its tip. Its base, surrounded by red, shouting roses, was formidable, titanic with weight and size, yet the tower became oddly graceful as it rose and tapered. The stone of which it had been made was not black, as he had imagined it would be, but soot-colored. Narrow and slitted, windows marched about it in a rising spiral. Below the windows ran an almost endless flight of stone stairs, circling up and up. The tower was a dark gray exclamation point planted in the earth, rising above the field of blood-red roses. The sky arched above it was blue, but filled with puffy white clouds like sailing ships. They flowed above and around the top of the dark tower in an endless stream. How gorgeous it is, Eddie marveled. How gorgeous and strange. But his feeling of joy and triumph had departed. He was left with a sense of deep malaise and impending doom. He looked about him and realized with sudden horror that he was standing in the shadow of the tower. No, not just standing in it, buried alive in it. He cried out, but his cry was lost in the golden blast of some tremendous horn. It came from the top of the tower and seemed to fill the world. As the note of warning held and drew out over the field where he stood, blackness welled from the windows which girdled the tower. It overspilled them and spread across the sky in flaggy streams which came together and formed a growing blotch of darkness. It did not look like a cloud. It looked like a tumor hanging over the earth. The sky was blotted out, and he saw it was not a cloud or a tumor, but a shape, something tenebrous, cyclopean shape racing toward the place where he stood. It would do no good to run from the beast, coalescing in the sky above the field of roses. It would catch him, clutch him, and bear him away. Into the dark tower it would bear him, and the world of light would see him no more. Rents formed in the darkness and terrible inhuman eyes, each easily the size of the bare Shardik, which lay dead in the forest, peered down at him. They were red, red as roses, red as blood. Jack Antolini's dead voice hammered in his ears. 1,000 worlds, Eddie. 10,000. And that train rolls through every one if you can get it started. And if you do get it started, your troubles are only beginning because this device is a real bastard to shut down. Jack's voice had become mechanical, chanting, "A real bastard to shut down, Eddie boy. You better believe it. This bastard is shutting down. Shutdown will be complete in 1 hour and 6 minutes." In his dream, Eddie threw his hands up to shield his eyes and woke, sitting bolt upright beside the dead campfire. He was looking at the world from between his own spread fingers, and still that voice rolled on, the voice of some heartless SWAT squad commander bellowing through a bullhorn. "There is no danger. Repeat, there is no danger. 5 subnuclear cells are dormant. 2 subnuclear cells are now in shutdown phase. 1 subnuclear cell is operating at 2% capacity. These cells are of no value. Repeat, these cells are of no value. Report location to North Central Positronics Limited. Call 1-900-44 uh, exclamation point troll positronics. The code word for this device is Shardik. Reward is offered. Repeat, reward is offered." The voice fell silent. Eddie saw Roland standing at the edge of the clearing, holding Susanna in the crook of one arm. They were staring toward the sound of the voice, and as the recorded announcement began again, Eddie was finally able to shake off the chill remnants of his nightmare. He got up and joined Roland and Susanna, wondering how many centuries it had been since that announcement, programmed to broadcast only in the event of a total system breakdown, had been recorded. "This device is shutting down. Shutdown will be complete in 1 hour and 5 minutes. There is no danger. Repeat." Eddie touched Susanna's arm, and she looked around. "How long has this been going on?" "About 15 minutes. You were dead to the She broke off. "Eddie, you look terrible. Are you sick?" "No, I just had a bad dream." Roland was studying him in a way that made Eddie feel uncomfortable. "Sometimes there's truth in dreams, Eddie. What was yours?" He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "You don't remember?" "You know I doubt that." Eddie shrugged and favored Roland with a thin smile. "Doubt away, then. Be my guest. And how are you this morning, Roland?" "The same," Roland said. His faded blue eyes still conned Eddie's face. "Stop it," Susanna said. Her voice was brisk, but Eddie caught an undertone of nervousness. "Both of you. I've got better things to do than watch you two dance around and kick each other's shins like a couple of little kids playing two for flinchin', especially this morning. And that dead bear trying to yell down the whole world." The gunslinger nodded, but kept his eyes on Eddie. "All right. But are you sure there's nothing you want to tell me, Eddie?" He thought about it, then really thought about telling. What he had seen in the fire, what he had seen in his dream. He decided against it. Perhaps it was only the memory of the rose and the fire and the roses which had blanketed that dream field in such a fabulous profusion. He knew he could not tell these things as his eyes had seen them and his heart had felt them. He could only cheapen them. And at least for the time being, he wanted to ponder these things alone. But remember, he told himself again, except the voice in his mind didn't sound much like his own. It seemed deeper, older, the voice of a stranger. "Remember the rose and the shape of the key." "I will," he murmured. "You will what?" Roland asked. "Tell," Eddie said. "If anything that comes up that seems, really important, I'll tell you. Both of you. Right now there isn't. So if we're gonna go somewhere, Shane, old buddy, let's saddle up. Shane? Who is this Shane? I'll tell you that some other time too. Meanwhile, let's go. They packed the gear they had brought with them from the old campsite and headed back. Susanna riding in her wheelchair again. Eddie had an idea she wouldn't be riding in it for long. Hold on, I'm going to see where my next stopping point would be from this one. Okay. Once before, Eddie had become too interested in the subject of heroin to be interested in much else. He and a couple of friends had driven over to New Jersey to see a couple of speed metal groups, Anthrax and Megadeth, in concert at the Meadowlands. He believed that Anthrax had been slightly louder than the repeating announcement coming from the fallen bear, but he wasn't 100% sure. Roland stopped them while they were still half a mile from the clearing in the woods and tore 6 small scraps of cloth from his old shirt. They stuffed them in their ears and then went on. Even the cloth didn't do much to deaden the steady blast of sound. "This device is shutting down," the bear blared as they stepped into the clearing again. It lay as it had lain at the foot of the tree Eddie had climbed, a fallen colossus with its legs apart and its knees in the air like a furry female giant who had died trying to give birth. "Shutdown will be complete in 47 minutes. There is no danger." Yes, there is, Eddie thought, picking up the scattered hides which had not been shredded in either the bear's attack or its flailing death throes. Plenty of danger. To my fucking ears. He picked up Roland's gun belt and silently handed it over. The chunk of wood he had been working on lay nearby, and he grabbed it, tucked it into the pocket in the back of Susanna's wheelchair, as the gunslinger slowly buckled the wide leather belt around his waist and cinched the rawhide tie down. In shutdown phase. 1 subnuclear cell operating at 1% capacity. These cells. Susanna followed Eddie, holding in her lap a carry-all bag she had sewn herself. As Eddie handed her the hides, she stuffed them into the bag. When all of them were stored away, Roland tapped Eddie on the arm and handed him a shoulder pack. What it contained mostly was deer meat, heavily salted from a natural lick Roland had found around 3 miles up the little creek. The gunslinger had already donned a similar pack. His purse, restocked and once again bulging with all sorts of odds and ends, hung from his other shoulder. A strange homemade harness with a seat of stitched deerskin dangled from a nearby branch. Roland plucked it off, studied it for a moment, and then draped it over his back and knotted the straps below his chest. Susanna made a sour face at this, and Roland saw it. He did not try to speak. This close to the bear, he couldn't have made himself heard, even by shouting at the top of his voice. But he shrugged sympathetically and spread his hands. "You know we'll need it." She shrugged back. "I know, but that doesn't mean I like it." The gunslinger pointed across the clearing. A pair of leaning, splintered spruce trees marked the place where Shardik, who had once been known as Mur in these parts, had entered the clearing. Eddie leaned toward Susanna, made a circle with his thumb and forefinger, then raised his eyebrows interrogatively. "Okay?" She nodded, then pressed the heels of her palms against her ears. "Okay, but let's get out of here before I go deaf." The three of them moved across the clearing, Eddie pushing Susanna, who held the bag of hides in her lap. The pocket in the back of the wheelchair was stuffed with other items. The piece of wood, the slingshot still mostly hidden inside it, was only one of them. From behind them, the bear continued to roar out its final communication to the world, telling them shutdown would be complete in 40 minutes. Eddie couldn't wait. The broken spruces leaned in toward each other, forming a rude gate, and Eddie thought, this is where the quest for Roland's Dark Tower really begins. At least for us. He thought of his dream again, the spiraling windows issuing their unfurling flags of darkness, flags which spread over the field of roses like a strain, and as they passed beneath the leaning trees, a deep shudder gripped them. Him. Deep shudder gripped him. They were able to use the wheelchair longer than Roland had expected. The firs of this forest were very old, and their spreading branches had created a deep carpet of needles which discouraged most undergrowth. Susanna's arms were strong, stronger than Eddie's, although Roland did not think that would be true much longer, and she wheeled herself along easily over the level, shady forest floor. When they came to one of the trees the bear had pushed over, Roland lifted her out of the chair and Eddie boosted it over the obstacle. From behind them, only a little deadened by distance, the bear told them at the top of its mechanical voice that the capacity of its last operating nuclear subcell was now negligible. I hope you keep that damn harness lying empty over your shoulder all day, Susanna shouted at the gunslinger. Roland agreed, but less than 15 minutes later, the land began to slope downward, and this old section of the forest began to be invaded with smaller, younger trees, birch, alder, and a few stunted maples scrabbling grimly in the soil for purchase. The carpet of needles thinned, and the wheels of Susanna's chair began to catch in the low, tough brushes which grew in the alleys between the trees, their thin branches boinging and rattled in the stainless steel spokes. Eddie threw his weight against the handles, and they were able to go on for another quarter of a mile that way. Then the slope began to grow more steep, and the ground underfoot became mushy. Time for a pigback, lady, Roland said. Let's try the chair a little longer. What do you say? Going might get easier. Roland shook his head. If you try that hill, you'll. What did you call it, Eddie? Do a dugout? Eddie shook his head, grinning. It's called doing a donut, Roland. A term from my misspent sidewalk surfing days. Whatever you call it, means you'll be landing on your head. Come on, Susanna. Up you come. I hate being a cripple, Susanna said crossly, but allowed Eddie to hoist her out of the chair and worked with him to seat herself firmly in the harness Roland wore on his back. Once she was in place, she touched the butt of Roland's pistol. You'll want this, babe. You want this, baby? She asked Eddie. He shook his head. You're faster, and you know it too. She grunted and adjusted the belt, settling the gun butt so it was easily accessible to her right hand. I'm slowing you boys down, and I know that. But if we ever make it to some good old two-lane blacktop, I'll leave the both of you kneeling in the blocks. I don't doubt it, Roland said, and then cocked his head. The woods had fallen silent. Brer Bear has finally given up, Susanna said. Praise God. I thought it still had 7 minutes to go, Eddie said. Roland adjusted the straps of the harness. Its clock must have started running a little slow during the last 500 or 600 years. You really think it was that, old Roland? Roland nodded. At least, and now it's past, the last of the 12 guardians for all we know. Yeah, ask me if I give a shit, Eddie replied, and Susanna laughed. Are you comfortable? Roland asked her. No, my butt hurts already, but go on. Just try not to drop me. Roland nodded and started down the slope. Eddie followed, pushing the empty wheelchair and trying not to bang it too badly on the rocks which had begun to jut out of the ground like big white knuckles. Now that the bear had finally shut up, he thought the forest seemed much too quiet. It almost made him feel like a character in one of those hokey old jungle movies about cannibals and giant apes. The bear's back trail was easy to find but tougher to follow. 5 miles or so out of the clearing, it led them through a low, boggy area that was not quite a swamp. By the time the ground began to rise and firm up a little again, Roland's faded jeans were soaked to the knees, and he was breathing in long, steady rasps. Still, he was in slightly better shape than Eddie, who had found wrestling Susanna's wheelchair through the muck and standing water hard going. Time to rest and eat something, Roland said. Oh boy, gimme eats, Eddie puffed. He helped Susanna out of the harness and led her down on the bole of a fallen tree with its claw marks slashed into its trunk in long diagonal grooves. Then he half sat, half collapsed next to her. You got my wheelchair pretty muddy, white boy, Susanna said. It's all going to be in my report. He cocked an eyebrow at her. Next car wash we come to, I'll push you through myself. I'll even turtle wax the goddamn thing, okay? She smiled. You got a date, handsome. Eddie had one of Roland's water skins cinched around his waist. He tapped it. Okay? Yes, Roland said. Not too much now. A little more for all of us before we set out again. That way no one takes a cramp. Roland, Eagle Scout of Oz, Eddie said, and giggled as he unslung the water skins. What is this Oz? A make-believe place in a movie, Susanna said. Oz was a lot more than that. My brother Henry used to read me the stories once in a while. I'll tell you one some night, Roland. That would be fine, the gunslinger replied seriously. I am hungry to know more of your world. Oz isn't our world, though. Like Susanna said, it's a make-believe place. Roland handed them chunks of meat which had been wrapped in broad leaves of some sort. The quickest way to learn about a new place is to know what it dreams of. I would hear of this Oz. Okay, that's a date too. Suze, can you tell the one about Dorothy and Toto and the Tin Woodman, and I'll tell you all the rest. He bit into the piece of meat and rolled his eyes approvingly. It had taken the flavor of the leaves in which it had been rolled and was delicious. Eddie wolfed his ration, stomach gurgling busily all the while. Now that he was getting his breath back, he felt good. Great, in fact. His body was growing a solid sheath of muscle, and every part of it felt at peace with every other part. Don't worry, he thought. Everything will be arguing again by tonight. I think he's going to push on until I'm ready to drop in my tracks. Susanna ate more delicately, chasing every second or third bite with a little sip of water, turning the meat in her hands, eating from the outside in. Finish what you started last night, she invited Roland. You said you thought you understood these conflicting memories of yours. Roland nodded. Yes, I think both memories are true. One is a little truer than the other, but that does not negate the truth of that other. Makes no sense to me, Eddie said. Either this boy Jake was at the way station or he wasn't, Roland. It is a paradox, something that is and isn't at the same time. Until it's resolved, I will continue divided. That's bad enough, but the basic split is widening. I can feel that happening. It is unspeakable. What do you think caused it? Susanna asked. I told you the boy was pushed in front of a car. Pushed. Now, do we know who liked to push people in front of things? Understanding dawned in her face. Jack Mort. Do you mean he was the one who pushed this boy into the street? Yes. But you said the man in black did it, Eddie objected. Your buddy Walter, you said the boy saw him, a man who looked like a priest. Didn't the kid even hear him say he was? Let me through, I'm a priest, something like that. Oh, Walter was there. They were both there. And they both pushed Jake. Somebody bring the Thorazine and the straitjacket, Eddie called. Roland just went straight over the high side. Roland paid no attention to this. He was coming to understand that Eddie's jokes and clowning were his way of dealing with stress. Cuthbert had not been much different. As Susanna was, in her way, not so different from Elaine. What exasperates me about all of this, he said, is that I should have known. I was in Jack Mort, after all, and I had access to his thoughts, just as I had access to yours, Eddie, and yours, Susanna. I saw Jake while I was in Mort. I saw him through Mort's eyes, and I knew Mort planned to push him. Not only that, I stopped him from doing it. All I had to do was enter his body, not that he knew that that was what it was. He was concentrating so hard on what he planned to do that he actually thought I was a fly landing on his neck. Eddie began to understand. If Jake wasn't pushed into the street, he never died, and if he never died, he never came into this world, and if he never came into this world, You never met him at that way station, right? Right. The thought even crossed my mind that if Jack Mort meant to kill the boy, I would have to stand aside and let him do it, to avoid creating the very paradox that is now tearing me apart. But I couldn't do that. I. You couldn't kill this kid twice, could you? Eddie asked softly. Every time I just about make up my mind that you're as mechanical as that bear, you surprise me with something that actually seems human. God damn. Quit it, Eddie, Susanna said. Eddie took a look at the gunslinger's slightly lowered face and grimaced. Sorry, Roland. My mother used to say that my mouth had a bad habit of running away with my mind. It's all right. I had a friend who was the same way. Cuthbert? Roland nodded. He looked at his diminishing right hand for a long moment, then clenched it into a painful fist, sighed, and looked up at them again. Somewhere, deeper in the forest, a lark sang sweetly. Here's what I believe. If I had not entered Jack Mort when I did, he still wouldn't have pushed Jake that day. Not then. Why not? Quartet. Simple as that. For the first time since the last of the friends with whom I set forth on this quest died, I have found myself once again in the center of Quartet. Quartet? Eddie asked doubtfully. The gunslinger shook his head. Ka. The word you think of as destiny. Eddie, although the actual meaning is so much more complex and hard to define, as is almost always the case with words of high speech, and tet, which means a group of people with the same interest and goals. We three are a tet, for instance. Quartet is the place where many lives are joined by fate. Like in the bridge of San Luis Rey, Susanna murmured. What's that? Roland asked. A story about some people who die together when the bridge they're crossing collapses. It's famous in our world. Roland nodded his understanding. In this case, Quartet bound Jake, Walter, and Jack Mort and me. There was no trap, as I first suspected when I realized who Jack Mort meant to be his next victim, because Quartet cannot be changed or bent to the will of any one person, but Quartet can be seen, known, and understood. Walter saw, and Walter knew. The gunslinger struck his thigh with his fist and exclaimed bitterly how he must have been laughing inside when I finally caught up to him. Let's go back to what would have happened if you hadn't messed up Jack Mort's plan on the day he was following Jake, Eddie said. You're saying that if you hadn't stopped Mort, someone or something else might have, is that right? Yes, because it wasn't the right day for Jack to die. He was close to the right day, but not the right day. I felt that too. Perhaps just before he did it. Mort would have seen someone watching him, or a perfect stranger would have intervened, or a cop, Susanna said. He might have seen a cop in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes. The exact reason the agent of Quartet doesn't matter. I know from first-hand experience that Mort was as wily as an old fox. If he sensed any slightest thing wrong, he would have called it off and waited for another day. I know something else as well. He hunted in disguise. On the day he dropped the brick on Detta Holmes' head, he was wearing a knitted cap and an old sweater several sizes too big for him. He wanted to look like a wine bibber, because he pushed the brick from a building where a large number of sots kept their dens, you see? They nodded. On the day years later when he pushed you in front of the train, Susanna, he was dressed as a construction worker. He was wearing a big yellow helmet he thought of as a hard hat and a fake mustache. On the day when he would have actually pushed Jake into traffic, causing his death, he would have been dressed as a priest. Jesus, Susanna nearly whispered. The man who pushed him in New York was Jack Mort, and the man he saw at the way station was this fella you were chasing. Walter? Yes. And the little boy thought they were the same man because they were both wearing the same kind of black robe? Roland nodded. There was even a physical resemblance between Walter and Jack Mort. Not as if they were brothers, I don't mean that, but both were tall men with dark hair and very pale complexions, and given the fact that Jake was dying when he got his only good look at Mort, and he was in a strange place and scared almost witless when his only good look at Walter, I think his mistake was both understandable and forgivable. If there's a horse's ass in this picture, it's me for not realizing the truth sooner. Would Mort have known he was being used? Eddie asked, thinking back to his own experiences and wild thoughts when Roland had invaded his mind. He didn't see how Mort could not know. But Roland was shaking his head. Walter would have been extremely subtle. Mort would have thought the priest disguised his own idea, or so I believe. He would not have recognized the voice of an intruder, of Walter whispering deep within his mind, telling him what to do. Jack Mort, Eddie marveled. It was Jack Mort all the time. Yes, with assistance from Walter, and so I ended up saving Jack's life after all. When I made Mort jump from the subway platform in front of the train, I changed everything. Susanna asked, if this Walter was able to enter our world through his own private door, maybe whatever he wanted, couldn't he have used someone else to push your little boy? If he could suggest to Mort that he dress up like a priest, then he could make somebody else do it. What, Eddie? Why are you shaking your head? Because I don't think Walter would want that to happen. What Walter wanted is what is happening. For Roland to be losing his mind bit by bit. Isn't that right? The gunslinger nodded. Walter couldn't have done it that way even if he had wanted to, Eddie added, because he was dead long before Roland found the doors on the beach. When Roland went through the last one and into Jack Mort's head, old Walt's messin' around days were done. Susanna thought about this, then nodded her head. I see. I think. This time travel business is some confusing shit, isn't it? 1 second. Okay, gotta find where I was. Roland began to pick up his goods and strap them back into place. Time we were moving on. Eddie stood up and shrugged into his pack. You can take comfort from one thing at least, he told Roland. You, or this quartet business, were able to save the kid after all. Roland had been knotting the harness strings at his chest. Now he looked up, and the blazing clarity of his eyes made Eddie flinch backward. Have I? He asked harshly. Have I really? I'm going insane an inch at a time, trying to live with two versions of the same reality. If I had hoped at first that one or the other would begin to fade away, but that's not happening. In fact, the exact opposite is happening. Those two realities are growing louder and louder in my head, clamoring at each other like opposing factions which must soon go to war. So tell me this, Eddie. How do you suppose Jake feels? How do you suppose it feels to know you are dead in one world and alive in another? The lark sang again, but none of them noticed it. Eddie stared into the faded blue eyes blazing out of Roland's pale face and could not think of a thing to say. They camped about 15 miles due east of the Dead Bear that night, slept the sleep of the completely exhausted. Even Roland slept that night, although his dreams were nightmares and carnival rides, and were up the next morning at sunrise. Eddie kindled a small fire without speaking and glanced at Susanna as a pistol shot rang out in the woods nearby. Breakfast, she said. Roland returned 3 minutes later with a hide slung over one shoulder. On it lay the freshly gutted corpse of a rabbit. Susanna cooked it. They ate and moved on. Eddie kept trying to imagine what it would be like to have a memory of your own death. On that one, he kept coming up short. Alright, guys. I think that is a good place to stop for today, and we will pick up again next week. Thank you, pretty shiny peoples, and later days and all that good stuff. Oh, don't forget to smile and have fun. And happy Thanksgiving or whatever harvest celebration you have. Bye.